Welcome back, Flyers Nitty Gritty fans, to Getting Gritty with It with your host, Wolok, my partner in crime, as always, Vasili Gianarakos. Vasili, how are you, buddy?
On a day like today, Yariv, where not much is happening, obviously, in the Flyer sphere, I'm doing
Nothing at
great.
all.
But no, yeah, to be serious, obviously with Matvei Michkov officially coming to Philadelphia, just very exciting news from a Flyers perspective, and for Flyers fans in general, right? Like they've been waiting, weren't sure when he was going to be able to make it over, and it's way earlier than expected. So overall, just very exciting stuff in general. And we have an amazing guest, on the podcast today that everybody knows and loves. So it's going to be a really, really fun episode. How are you
Yeah.
doing, buddy?
Yeah, I'm doing well, man. Obviously, the news today of arrival of Matvei Michkov was really exciting. Kind of got me glued to social media a little bit, especially to Twitter. And yeah, it's really cool to watch. And yeah, the fact that we had this episode with Jim Jackson kind of lined up, it's kind of perfect timing, almost in a way. Big guest and
Who
big
better to
news.
get the perspective of, right,
Right?
than
Yeah,
JJ himself, the voice of the
somebody
Flyers.
who actually works for the team, so it kind of worked out really well for us. All right. Before we go into the segment with Jim, just want to remind everybody, please like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for notifications. Follow us on iTunes and Spotify and give us a rating there if you can. Again, that is the best way to support our podcast. Our numbers have definitely gone up, and you guys are a big reason for that. So thank you all so much. If you're listening right now and you have not subscribed, please do so. It is tremendously helpful, and we appreciate it. I also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Jim Steaks at 4th and South. Just go get yourself a cheesesteak from Jim's at 4th and South. Again, they have amazing, amazing cheesesteaks. You can smell it from around the corner. And if you find yourself this summer on South Street or you just want a cheesesteak in general, make sure to go check out Jim Steaks. Also, shout out to Summit Public Adjusters, 215-752-0560. Again, go to them as your defense against insurance companies. They will check your claims. 215-752-0560. That's Summit Public Adjusters. And just want to give a brief shout out to our new partners, Sports Spider. Guys, if you're tired of searching multiple websites for sporting news, sportspider.com has you covered. They collect the latest articles, videos, and podcasts from around the web and organize them by your favorite teams if you want to stay up to date as possible on our Philadelphia Flyers or the NHL in general. Hit the link in the description for Sports Spider. Again, hit the link in the description for Sports Spider. Make sure to check them out. They are our official partners right now. All right, let's get into the Jim Jackson interview, and then we'll recap afterwards. So here it is. So now we intro our special guest. You definitely know who he is. Longtime broadcaster of the Philadelphia Flyers. Been on TNT, been on NBC. If you don't know him at this point, I don't know what you're doing listening to this podcast. Jim Jackson. Jim.
How are you guys?
Doing well, man. How are you?
Are you trying to tell me you don't have any Penguins fans watching the podcast?
I don't think so.
We
might have
might,
some
you never
Caps
know.
fans. I know we've had some Caps fans, that's for sure, but it varies. Most of our audience is definitely diehard Flyer fans, and majority in the U.S., but from all over. And I think that's a theme that you probably have noticed too. There just seem to be Flyer fans kind of all over the country. In
Oh yeah,
spurts.
all over the world. There's a healthy contingent in Europe. The Flyers aren't officially an original six team, but they're as close to it as you get without being an original six team. So because they established their legacy so early on as an expansion team in the 70s, and obviously contended through the 80s and the 90s, and got to get back to that. And I think we're on our way.
Yeah. Well, Vasili's from Toronto, so even half the show is not from.
I won't hold that against him.
Right. Me neither. I love him.
I wonder how carefully are you watching this John Tavares case?
Pretty carefully. Like
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's all the talk on sports radio here in Toronto. So we'll see what happens and where it goes. But
Yeah.
I mean, I personally think, as him being a Toronto guy, they'll probably end up coming to some sort of agreement potentially, but we'll see what happens.
What's going to be interesting is the impact it has in the tax situation for all Canadian athletes, not
Yeah.
even just hockey players. So It's becoming an issue in the NHL. I mean, there's no doubt Florida, Nashville, they have advantages with no income tax, state income tax. You can't. They're looking at the free agency now. It's all slanting toward these non-tax states. The league said they're not going to do anything about it, but it's becoming an issue. The competitive balance is something they really talk about. Well, that's not balanced. I mean, Reinhardt got a deal that he could only get pretty much in Florida or Tennessee, right? And that's probably a big reason why he stayed there. So is that fair? Because if he's in a Canadian city or in New York city or really any of the other states that have income tax, he's probably going to want at least 9.5, 10, right? So
it all adds up, right? In terms of those different states that are tax exempt.
Yeah, you certainly in Canada, there's a tax on everything. And
yes, unfortunately
in New Jersey, New York, if you're in those two states, you certainly can relate to the tax situation, and it definitely adds up. It definitely, adds to the cost of living. And so that is becoming, I think, a factor, but the league kind of said we're not going to look into that, so we'll see.
Yeah, I'll just say the CRA, just to end it off, like the CRA in Canada, I mean, they did their audit of whatever's going on with his taxes. He's going to have to pay them at the end of the day. It just is what it is. So no matter how much he fights it, we'll see with the lawyers, but usually they don't lose those types of cases.
Yeah, they're coming. Governments do not let go of taxes.
Yeah,
as we've seen in the past, but it is something I've been talking about for years, and I've heard a lot of people like I don't know if you know who SDPN is, Steve Dangle's network. It's a big YouTuber. They kind of downplayed, they're in Toronto, and they downplayed the tax issue, but it's absolutely a problem, and it affects every industry, not just the NHL. And again, when you have a salary cap, you're kind of maximizing how much people can spend, but it's kind of fake because a lot of these have, I mean, you can think of it as a higher salary cap because they don't have to account for those taxes. And I know 100% that athletes pay attention to taxes. Every single one of them. It is a small percentage of a very large number.
Which makes it a large number.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, for the average man, for the average woman, for the average person, their tax dollars are a salary. So,
or more than that.
It's definitely an issue. There's no, I would if I were an athlete, if I was making, anywhere. If I'm making the minimum $800,000, that the tax on that's a lot.
Still a huge number, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So, I think it's an issue. I was surprised the league kind of took the hands-off approach. They might not want to get involved with the government, and I mean there might not be any solution. That might really be the issue. So we'll see. But it's definitely become a factor, if not an issue. When you're looking at the free agency now and you see Nashville stockpile and you see some of these guys go back to Florida for what they went for, and you say, well, maybe they're the salary cap is definitely what makes hockey and some of the other sports different from a regular business, to your point. Yes, the tax situation exists for every person, but companies can adjust around it. In other businesses, you can't if you have a salary cap. So that makes it pretty impactful.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to come up in the next CBA conversations. It's something that has to be accounted for. I don't think it needs to be a humongous shift out of. So I'm actually not a huge fan of a salary cap, but I understand why it exists. But it's something that you have to account for, and you have to give teams a lever to use. Maybe you punish them financially for using it, but maybe not towards the cap. Like the team like the Flyers that can afford to pay a penalty, that revenue will go back to the league, but can make certain adjustments that their cap hit won't be the same, right? So you can pay a player a certain maybe bonus percentage that would be tax exempt or something like that. But again,
what makes it tough is
it's so tough.
Taxes are always moving too, so
right? And adjusting.
It's really a difficult. That's probably why the league took the stance they did. I mean, it's almost impossible to come up with a solution that's going to make everybody happy, if anyone. So let's just stay away from it for now and hope that Nashville and Florida don't go on a dynastic run here now, and it's only teams with the no income tax that start winning the cup. Then we have an issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. Kick that can down the road. All right, let's move on.
We all know this tax issue is the biggest thing to Flyers fans.
Yes. Top of the list. Nothing big happened today. We're all thinking about death and taxes. Let's get into the good stuff because, obviously we had some really I guess, exciting news. I wouldn't say it's like big news because it was kind of an inevitability. Nobody knew exactly when it was coming, but it was speculated that he was on his way. People are watching his social media posts. He's definitely aware of it, from what you can tell. And we did get the announcement this morning by the Flyers. That awesome post that they put out where I believe they're quoting the former president of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Maybe not the best line to use considering that context, but definitely hit home. And seeing Matvei Michkov arrive in Philadelphia, obviously there was a lot of excitement online today. We want to go into Michkov and get your thoughts overall, but maybe just your initial thoughts on, watching Michkov kind of come in, and seeing him land and kind of, the reaction to it.
Well, I mean, he now knows that John Clark sleeps at the airport. Then you have to be greeted by John Clark when you arrive if you're an athlete coming to Philadelphia. But also, I think that I mean, I get the feeling that you were getting tired of all the shots of him in Flyers garb over there in Russia. I guess you didn't like those pictures were starting to become too much of a tease for you. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. I want the real thing. I want to see the guy.
Yeah, well, you got it. You got it now. You got Danny Briere carrying his sticks. Keith Jones with a big smile on his face, and so he's here. Yeah, it's not since the announcement, which was a surprise because obviously most of the talk had been it would be 3 years, and it was cut down to 1. But since that he was going to be released from his contract came out, this was a certainty, we thought, but never with Russia is anything a certainty. So I think it's still a slight sense of relief to see his feet right here. I won't say his boots on the ground here, wrong way to say it, but his feet here on the ground in Philadelphia. So I think there's still slightly some relief from the standpoint of fans and all. And now it's about getting him, assimilated in, and that's part of the process here. I was hoping. I had heard some rumblings he wasn't coming till like a week before camp, and I'm like, yeah, nah, get him here as early as possible. Give him some time. It's not just about hockey. It's about his. He doesn't speak the language, so I think this month and a half will be really good for him before camp ramps up, and almost 2 months really. So good time for him to get used to being over here. Find out what he can eat and can't eat over here, and where he can go and where he shouldn't go, and all those things. So I think this will be very helpful. Of course, tomorrow I'm not sure when this is airing, but on Wednesday the press conference will be. Everybody will have eyes on that, and then there won't be much. I mean, he may make some appearances, but really, it's all about getting him, indoctrinated into American life, and Philadelphia life, and South Jersey life, wherever he's going to live, and then camp. And camp, all eyes will be on him again. So it's going to be exciting. And when I say camp, for him, it's going to be the rookie camp. So it'll start a little early, but I'm pretty sure that the training center, I didn't call it skate zone for once, the training center will be jam-packed when he hits the ice for the first time. And it's exciting. It's always exciting to have a talent come to one of the Philadelphia sports teams. It's exciting when it's a veteran free agent for sure, but there's an added extra excitement when it's a young player who you might be seeing the start of an era. You might be seeing the start of 10 to 15 years of this guy in the orange and black. So there's that extra little excitement when it's a young player like this coming. So there's definitely some buzz in Flyer Nation here tonight.
Oh, I totally agree. I think really with just what you said, Jim, with like the assimilation factor, that's obviously the huge thing, right? He's only a 19-year-old kid coming over from Russia, completely different country. He just has to take the time to really understand, the American lifestyle, kind of get comfortable, right? Because you have to think it's really his first time, being away from his family for a prolonged period of time, potentially being away from Russia for a prolonged period of time. So all of that's really important. I think as well, just the uncertainty surrounding him in general, the 2023 draft, like. Obviously he dropped to number 7 overall in the draft. There was, a lot of rankings that had him higher, but he ended up dropping just due to the uncertainty with Russia, when potentially Russian prospects could come over to the NHL and things like that. So I think in general, it's probably just a relief for the Flyers, even though the contract was signed. Just the fact that he's over here, that's all behind them now, essentially. And it's just great to see, the excitement on Matvei's face in general, like in the video shown, the pictures taken. You can even see Danny Briere and Keith Jones look very excited as well. So overall, just great news, especially when there wasn't really a timetable or concrete timetable on when he might be able to come over to North America when he was initially drafted.
Well, I think there was a timetable, and it was 3 years. So
yeah,
this is 2 years of bonus time. I never really thought that was a big deal, though, because he'd still be coming over here as a 21-year-old, and a lot of players, he would have been, as he will this year, playing at the NHL level, but he might not become an elite player until he's 21, 22, 23, 24. Who knows?
definitely.
So I wasn't too worried about the 3 years. I thought it was forward thinking by the Flyers, especially given their rebuilding. I didn't think it was as much. People were saying, well, this shows that they're not going to try to win for another 3 years. It was more, well, okay, so he's going to play over there in the KHL against men. He's going to get better. And in 3 years, he's still going to be one of the youngest players in the league anyhow. So I didn't really think there was that much of a gamble there. The gamble to me was with the things as they are in the world, that maybe he'd never come over because of Russia's, the geopolitical situation. So, very relieved to see that wasn't going to be the case, and I'm just ecstatic that it's just 1 year later, because we get to watch him, and this was going to be a low event off season for the Flyers, just given the salary cap where they're at with everything, some of the dead cap money and all that. So to have this happen, it really throws a lot of spice into what probably would have been a real, it was, other than this, a very quiet off season. So lots of excitement, and it's unfair that it's on one guy, because as we know, and we were talking about this before we started the podcast, I mean, hockey's not an individual sport. He cannot turn this team around by himself. I don't think he has to. I think the team's already turning around. That's the good news. He's not joining a decrepit Chicago team. He's joining a team that was within minutes of making the playoffs last year. So he's joining a pretty good team. Is he the piece that makes them a playoff team? I mean, I'm not going to put it all on him, but he is a power play kind of player. And the biggest problem for the Flyers over the last 3 years has been their power play. So if he makes their power play even mediocre, let's say they go from last to 22nd or 20th,
that's a huge improvement.
They probably make the playoffs if everything else is the same. And there's other issues, of course, goaltending, no Carter Hart for a whole year. Can Sam Harrison do it? We can get into all those other things. But still, if the power play is at least respectable, this team easily makes the playoffs last year. The power play was the worst in the league again. And so it's really hard to even be in contention with the power play numbers they had last year for a playoff spot. They managed that. Now they have this guy who looks all the world to be like a guy who can really be special when there's extra space on the ice, which obviously is the case when you're on the power play. And if he is kind of the thing that unlocks the power play, then I think this team could be improved. So, but I'm not going to put it all on him. It's just unfair. He's a teenager, as you said, got a lot on his plate, just trying to figure out where he's at, how to speak the language, how to interact with his teammates, how to interact with people in community, in the community, all that. He's got so much going on that, and I know he has a sense. You get that, as you alluded to. You get the sense he understands, that people are looking at him as the savior, but there really aren't any saviors. Many people put Connor McDavid in the top 4 or 5 players of all time. Some have anointed him the best of all time already. I don't even got to get into that. But bottom line is, he's a really great player. And he's into his mid now, going to his late 20s. Still hasn't won a cup. Came darn close this year, but it's the first time he even came close. So it's hard. You as one player cannot turn it around. He's going to need a lot of help. But as I said, they were pretty good last year. Maybe he takes them to very good, and maybe they make the playoffs. Do they win the cup? I'll never say no to that. I go into every season saying, why not? But will they be favored? Absolutely not. And will they need a lot to go right in order to be even close to contending and going on a playoff run, like for a cup? For sure. but maybe the playoffs. And that would be a good first step as they continue to try to improve.
So yeah, no, we agree with all that. We've been talking about how depth is a crucial part of building a roster and a team, and how depth actually wins championships. It's a big reason why I picked the Florida Panthers to win, is just the way that they were built from top to bottom, not just, looking at McDavid and Draisaitl. It's kind of, you can kind of see it in the tea leaves in most sports teams, that depth is really the reason they tend to win in the end. And there are some outliers there, but it's usually depth. But you mentioned that, Michkov is not coming into a bottom three team in the NHL that is quote unquote tanking, though I don't like that term. I don't even really think most people even know what tanking is to an extent. I think it's just kind of a term that's kind of repeated by people online.
There is another team in town that kind of showed you what it is. So,
well, yeah, the trust the process. They kind of like relabeled it to something, and it in a way it actually kind of failed, right? Because they really only
there's no
walked
doubt
away.
it failed.
Right, they walked away with one guy.
The only reason the one guy they got was kind of like what happened to the Flyers. They got a break that Michkov fell to them. Embiid was injured his draft year, and so he fell to them. And he has not gotten past the second round of the playoffs. So to me, the process failed. Now, I think they're going to be very good this year, and they have a chance to go further. But we said this before about the Sixers. Sure. And if they do it now, I mean, is it the process? I don't think so.
It's been years since that point.
Yeah, it's too far for that. I'm completely against tanking. I think sports are played because you're supposed to try to win. So besides, the NHL is really hard to tank in because you're not guaranteed anything if you finish at the bottom, as the Flyers well know. And, Patrick Kane, James Van Riemsdyk. I love JVR. He's one of my best buds that's played here. But I mean, the Flyers could have had Patrick Kane, right? So
would have been a different story for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so you don't, when you think about tanking in the NHL, A, you're not guaranteed the best pick. B, as the Sabres and so many other teams have shown, you can have a zillion high picks in 5, 6, 7, 8, in their case, 12 years in a row, and it doesn't guarantee you're going to turn it around.
Right.
It's that difficult. So there's no tanking. This leadership group, with Dan Hilferty at the top, and Keith Jones and Danny Briere and John Tortorella, they are fully involved in being competitive now and great later. And when I say great later, I mean like it used to be in the 90s, early aughts,
sure,
through the aughts, really, except for the one really down year. Basically, every season, the Flyers at the beginning of the year are considered one of the teams that can win the Stanley Cup, right? That's what they want to get back to. They don't want to be getting back to where they were during the teens, in the playoff one year, out the next, in and winning, not even winning around. That's not contending. That's better than being at the bottom if you're talking wins and losses, but that's not contending. Contending is you go into the year and you have a chance to win the cup. People think your team has a chance to win the cup, and that, to win it, a lot of things still have to fall into place. But that's, I think, where they're headed. And they're really building a good base of young talent on this team. I think Tyson Forster could have a spectacular year. Owen Tippett, I still think, is a 40-goal scorer, not a 30-goal scorer. If, the one thing they're missing, and they're still missing it, even with Matvei here, is the center, right? They don't have depth. They don't have centers, period, really, unless Morgan Frost takes a huge step up and Sean Couturier is back to the Sean Couturier that he was before the back surgeries. If those two things happen, they're okay at 1 and 2, right?
Sure.
Still lack depth in the organization. Jetlichenko is a long way away. And so, it's going to be interesting to see how they fill that hole should the team get competitive. Like, if this team's in a playoff spot at the trade deadline, I mean, solidly in a playoff spot, do they go out and get a center?
That'll be fascinating to see.
It'll be interesting. I don't know if we're to that stage of the rebuild yet. I think you'll have to see what it looks like. I mean, how did they get to that position? Is Michkov just tearing it up? Is the power play all revived? Is Sam Harrison showing he's the real deal? All those ifs, they all go positive.
Right.
Do they suddenly then say, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to get either a rental or I don't think they have a problem with a rental, because that, as long as you're not giving up like a first round pick or anything, you can get the rental and say goodbye to him if you're still continuing your rebuild. but they're not going to get older players that they're going to be tied to via salary. That I don't think they're at that stage of the rebuild yet at all. So, but be interesting to see how they try to fortify it if this team again surprises and is contending. But we're a long way away from that. We're in July. Right now, it's just about a really good young talent is here, and we'll see what impact he has.
Yeah, we talk about that quite a bit, how it's kind of one of those things where that's why I don't really believe in tanking is, you kind of continue to evaluate as things go, and depending on how things turn out, that's how you kind of like you have a goal set in mind, you have a plan, but that plan could change if the performance changes on the ice to some
continue
degree.
To progress, right, Yariv, right? If the progression continues, maybe it changes the thought process for the management and makes things more tempting at the trade deadline potentially. Sorry, Yariv, go ahead.
No, my bad. Real quick, I want to revisit Michkov a little bit because there's a couple of things around there. You touched on some of it. So expectation wise, I think you laid out a pretty good detail of what mentally where you expect. He is right now favored, at least in the betting market, to win the Calder Trophy, rookie.
There you go again. You're in.
I know. I know.
Going to win the Stanley Cup in his first year.
I know, it's a Freudian slip. So he is slated to be top contender. You have Celebrini out there. You have former Flyer prospect Gauthier out there. You have Will Smith, Celebrini's teammate, out there. Stankoven's out there, and I think Lane Hudson are the top six, with Michkov being at the top there. Productivity wise is really hard to predict. Vasili and I have kind of guesstimated anywhere between 40 to 65 points. 70 points would be phenomenal as a rookie. Where do you kind of see Michkov playing out? And I guess to compile that together, what do you see his relationship with Torts, being if he's going to have this highly productive season, let's say in that 60-point range, similar to what Bedard was able to do, even though he was close to a point per game. Where do you kind of see, his productivity falling, and how do you see him kind of mixing in with Torts to get to that level of productivity?
Yeah, one has a lot to do with the other.
Yeah.
I think it's more important than getting 70 points in his first year that he develops an all-around game.
Sure.
He is very much an offensive player. This is not a finished product. And John Tortorella is a guy who likes to finish products. So he's done it a lot, but there is usually some short-term pain to get there. You think of Zach Werenski. There's a lot of players that have played for him that had some tense times early, but you talk to Zach Werenski about him now, he just raves about what John Tortorella did for his career. So, it's not going to all be a smooth ride, I don't think. And by saying that, I don't mean they're going to be at each other's throats. I'm just saying I think there may be some times where he sits on the bench or even doesn't play. That's just Torts' way. Mm-hmm. And Torts is not one to shy away from scratching a guy when he's going back to his hometown or scratching a guy when he's playing where he played his junior hockey. We've seen that. So he's not going to be afraid to scratch this big time prospect if he feels he deserves it. So given that Matvei clearly has things to work on in his game defensively, I'm not going to get into predicting points, but I will say that, he's going to have to earn that ice time. And that's just the way it is with most teams, but certainly with John Tortorella coach team. You have to earn your ice time. You're going to have to earn the power play. I do think, unlike I think maybe popular opinion, that Torts is willing to concede a defensive faux pas here or there if the guy is producing. Travis Konecny is not a Selke Trophy winner. He self-admittedly will make mistakes on the ice with poor puck management or bad coverage once in a while, but his effort level is always there, and he was producing at such a level that Torts pretty much this past year, although there was one game where he went missing for a period, but for the most part, TK was still getting his ice time. He was obviously 2 years ago, missed a whole period, famously in that game against San Jose with Kevin Hayes. They were stapled to the bench. But after that, TK picked up the message, went in and talked to Torts, and since then, there haven't been any issues that way. Because he's producing, because he's playing with effort. He's not a great defensive player, perhaps, makes mistakes, sometimes thinks offense before defense, but Torch saw what TK brought with some of that gambling offense and figured it's worth the risk. That clearly Michkov is going to have some ridiculously good offensive plays, and if Torch sees that he's producing there, he's going to be maybe a little bit more lenient on his defensive play. A lot of people bring up Morgan Frost when it comes to this. Torch would always talk about when he would sit Morgan, he wasn't seeing enough offensively from Morgan. Morgan's not going to be a Selke Trophy winner in all likelihood either. But and there were mistakes there, but there wasn't enough in those times when Torch got mad at him at the offensive end to keep playing him. So whether Michkov gets to that point, I don't know. He's a 19-year-old. We can't expect him to just step in and light the world on fire. Connor Bedard, from people I talk to that saw him every day, was he put up those almost point per game, and he clearly was the Calder Trophy winner, and deservedly so. But there's a lot of holes in his game. His defensive play, his defensive, his puck management in the defensive zone, or even in the neutral zone, which led to plays in his own zone, not good. So the best player, he's generational, Connor Bedard, still has to round that game out. Michkov's very similar. It was only about 5 years ago that it was the Bedard-Michkov draft. So
sure.
Matvei may be very similar to Connor Bedard in terms of that skill level, but that doesn't mean he's still not going to have to work on the defensive side of his game. So a long-winded answer to your question is, if he's going to get 70 points, he's probably going to have to be really good defensively too, because under Torts to play all the time and get all the ice time and get the power play time and all that, you've got to at least be showing effort defensively and not be a liability defensively all the time. So that will be interesting to watch. There's a big question here. Is it good or bad that you have a tough love coach coaching a high-end, potentially, I hate the term, generational talent? Is it good or bad? You get the one side, they say, you're going to lose the kid. You're going to lose him before he's even 20. And then the other side say, that's the way you get him to be a great player. That it's going to be maybe some bumps in the road in the first year or two, but in the end, you're going to have a better player because of that kind of approach. I tend to lean toward the latter of those two, but there's gray area for me in there, and it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think to your point, like pointing out Bedard's defensive mishaps in his rookie year, or not being a complete product. Even McDavid, right, when he came into the league, great offensively, but defensively, there were still a lot of things to round out in his game. So I think for Michkov, we're going to see something similar. Like obviously the offensive talent, the offensive skill is there, especially for what you've seen in the KHL. He was able to play against men. Some of that will translate right away, but there'll even be some intricacies of the NHL game that he'll have to learn and get accustomed to as well offensively. But I do see that, like with Tortorella, that will probably be a main contention point potentially, right? Like the defensive play, how that shapes up, how that affects Michkov's ice time. But just in terms of like the overall relationship with Tortorella and with Michkov, I personally don't have many concerns. And the reason being for me, is if you just look at all the players that Tortorella's coached in the past, where there were disputes between him and players, but it ended up being successful. Like you obviously look at Martin St. Louis from a long while ago, Vincent Lecavalier, several players that he coached on the Rangers, whether it be like a Ryan Callahan type, Zach Werenski, Seth Jones. So personally, I think that there's been a lot more success stories with Tortorella helping players develop, helping them learn that defensive side of the game and certain things and certain aspects that maybe other coaches might not, try to kind of put into their actual playing style as much. So it'll be interesting to see how the relationship goes. But personally, I don't think there should be much of a concern because you just look at all the players that he's helped develop over the years.
Yeah, he coexisted with Panarin too. A lot of people thought that he left Columbus because of Torts, but that was not the case. Both actually speak very highly of one another. Torts loved Artemi Panarin, so that is not a player that you would think of for his defensive work. He's a very skilled, high-end, elite offensive player. So Torts he's been around. He's seen all kinds of players, all kinds of personalities. I think he'll be able to adjust to it. It's up to whether Michkov can adjust to getting some of that tough love. I'm pretty sure he's pretty much had his way. He's been so talented from such a young age. That's probably more to what I'm going to be watching. I know how Torts will handle it, I'm pretty sure, but I'm not 100% sure how Mishkov's going to handle it. And I think that's what we all watch.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I do kind of suspect, just again, I'm not Russian personally, I'm Israeli, but I do have a Russian group of my family. I do tend to understand the culture at least a little bit, and they tend to have a pretty hard attitude. I imagine he's probably had some coaches that believe in, the tough love mentality. So I don't think it's something that at least will be completely new to him. But I do think you bring up a great point where he's always been the best player, and sometimes it's like a little bit of a sticker shock. Now, I do want to, we'll end on Michkov on this note. Um, Tortorella did name, and I don't know if he came up with this or this is the term they were using behind closed doors. He named him the Mad Russian, but what I thought was more interesting is the fact that Tortorella was paying attention to a prospect. From my understanding of Tortorella, he doesn't pay attention to any prospects. He's not out there looking at video of young players around the world. He focuses on the team in front of him and how to improve them. But in this case, there seems to be some kind of exception, and he mentioned kind of preparing the team to play a certain style that Michkov excels in. What do you think about those comments? Because we're kind of speculating here, but it does seem like he himself is excited for what Michkov brings. I do imagine the tough love thing will be there. I don't think he's going to change. But it does seem like that he sees something in Michkov that at least gets him excited enough to, slap a nickname on him publicly, and then talk about how he wants them to be prepared for when this kid gets here.
Well, I mean, he'd have to be in a cocoon somewhere, not to
Sure. Sure.
I mean, this guy has been talked about since he was a young teen, and then the Flyers drafted him. I don't think John Tortorella was sitting there on his computer watching his games in the KHL last year, but he heard. I mean, everybody in the organization was crazy when the day after or even the day of he'd have one of those moves that was all over YouTube. So, I mean, there's an excitement there. I mean, hell, how can he not be excited? This is a power play guy, and
Yeah.
Torts knows how much that hurt the team last year. And above and beyond all of the talk, and Torts is certainly on board with the rebuild, but he hates losing. So he wants to win. He wanted to make the playoffs last year. So this gives them a better chance to win if he turns out to be a legitimate power play performer, an elite power play performer. And also remember that if he's able to do that, if Michkov's able to be tremendous on the power play, that will give him a little bit more of that leeway we were talking about earlier, because that is such an important element to this team. They just have not had. Claude Giroux is a great power play performer, but more of a playmaker. This is a guy who can not only be a playmaker, but he can finish plays too. So it's going to be very intriguing is the only word that comes to mind to see the mix there. But again, like I don't think there's much to really. I'm not expecting anything but what I've seen for 25 years, 30 years from John Tortorella as a coach. I'm not really thinking much is going to be different there. It's really whether Michkov deals with it well, doesn't go into, a pout mode or behind the scenes, I'm going back to Russia kind of stuff. That's, I don't think it's going to happen for sure because he's happy to be over here. He's got all kinds of energy. I choose to think it's going to be the other way around. These two both are high energy people, and there'll be moments, of course, but I think together they're both going to have such energy. It's going to be a lot of fun to be around. And but we just don't know. That we just don't know. So we'll get a good look at it. We don't even know how well he's going to play. I mean, there's just so many variables out there to dive into on this, and it's fun to have that kind of potential situation to look at, because really there hasn't been a player with this kind of talent level in a while. I mean, Giroux is probably the last one, in his prime, and so this is going to be exciting to watch and to see how he fits in, how he and Torts. It's not just about he and Torts. It's about how he fits in with the veteran leaders and what they say to him. I'm sure you're going to hear this from Torts at some point. What those veteran leaders say to him is going to be as important as what Torts says to him. So, and they have a Russian veteran. I mean, there's a lot of talk to go out and get some kind of veteran Russian. It's going to be hard to expect Fedotov to he's going to be doing the same thing, trying to get adjusted. So, it's going to be interesting to see. Zamula, I suppose, is close, but it'll be interesting. I mean, that's not exactly a guy I would say has been around the world or two in the NHL either. So, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But first things first, just get them here, get them as they have, and then get them used to life. I'm sure the players, there's still some in town now, and they get here so early now. They'll be here in a month's time, just about, a little less in some cases. And so they'll all, I'm sure, be part of the process of getting him into the orange and black way. This is a very tight room last year. That's why Garnet Hathaway wants to sign an extension early. That's why Eric Johnson wants to come play here, and probably the last year of his career. It's why Mark Stahl, as it turned out, came back to play and knew he wasn't going to play as much. They sensed that this was a really good room, and the Flyers have always and continued to, and this was put in place by Ed Snyder. They treat their players top notch. I mean, it's best hotels on the road, travel's awesome. The facilities are second to none. It's the players are treated like gold here. So he's going to get that. He's going to see that. Who knows what he was seeing over in Russia? I mean, I don't know. But from a facility standpoint and all of that. So I think there's going to be a lot of things he's going to be really positive about. So I think the excitement's going to be there. The press conference will be interesting to watch because even at the draft, when he was drafted, he had that twinkle in his eye. Even though he couldn't speak too much English, he got the point across of how pumped up he was. So.
Sure. Yeah. All right, let's transition into, you mentioned TK already. But his we love TK on this podcast. We're definitely in the camp of keeping him and not trading him. I know there's like a large contingency online that wants to move him away. Again, we don't believe in tanking. We believe in building iteratively. And when you have a young guy who's successful here, wants to be here, you find a way to keep him. However, we haven't heard anything lately. We heard a rumored number. Neither Vasili and I don't want to speak for you too much, but neither one of us really believe that will be the final number. But we understand why the player would start at $10 million. But we believe the negotiations ongoing right now. What are your thoughts about the silence around the TK situation? Do you have kind of a cutoff where you think that kind of don't have a choice but to move him? Or do you think this is something that could go all through the year? How do you kind of see the situation right now? That
really depends on how the player and his agent feel about it. Let me be very clear. Very clear. About a week ago, I went on the radio and I said, I'm hearing 10 million. And of course, my friend Rhodes put it into a tweet, made it clickbait, and my line has not stopped since. I heard 10 million early on in the process.
Yeah.
Since that happened, the market's not borne that out when you're looking at comps. I mean, whether Buchnevich, Reinhardt, and Kachuk are comps to TK. Not exact. None of them are exact comps to TK, obviously. I would say Kachuk is probably the closest, and he's a little younger, but in terms of style of play, production level, although he's more physical than TK, but TK does bring that physical side too, and he gets underneath the skin of opponents like Kachuk and all that. And they didn't get 10. So, none of those guys got 10. So I'm thinking this is completely my thought. I have no inside knowledge, as most people should know. I spend my summers swimming, golfing, going on vacations, watching tennis, golf, and a little baseball. That's about it. I do not call TK or his agent or call Keith Jones and the Flyers. And
thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. So I know nothing. So if you guys are going to clip anything I say here,
No.
you have to have that disclaimer on the bottom. This man knows nothing.
Don't worry,
You
I know a lot
got
of
it.
we
people
got
know
you
me
covered.
wholeheartedly agree that I know nothing. So, but I mean, it's going to be a tough decision. As far as the silence, you asked me about that first. I wouldn't be shocked if tomorrow they roll out both TK and Matvei and say
Oh,
we've
that'd be
signed
awesome.
TK to, because Keith Jones, from hiding his own ascent to the presidency to
Sure.
hiding the Cutter Gauthier situation to everything, he has kept everything quiet.
I love that too.
From the media. He knew the access he had, we had. He's cut much of that off. And he's keeping everything very quiet. So, and for the Cutter thing, it was vital because I don't know how he did that because he was talking with other teams and how he kept the other teams quiet.
Sometimes the other loop, right? That's where these things come out. So
yeah, I mean, it was hard to believe that they kept that. I mean, the one thing that came out that might have affected the Flyers since Danny took over was the potential trade with St. Louis, but that was all Blues leaking
on their side, yeah.
But that's what made keeping the Cutter thing quiet because there was more than one team involved there, and they did. I mean, nobody knew about that. When the trade was announced in the middle of the game, everybody's like, "Say what?" So, I mean, if they can keep that quiet, they can certainly keep contract negotiations with Travis Konecny. All they have to worry about are TK, his family, his agent, and themselves. So if they can keep the Cutter Gauthier thing quiet, they can keep the negotiations quiet. So at any point this summer, they could come out with a contract extension. I would not be shocked because I don't think it's not going to be done through the media, which is why some people yelled when I said I'm hearing 10 million and said, there go the Flyers negotiating through the media. No, I don't know anything. This was not the Flyers thing.
I didn't realize that came from you.
But
yeah, I mean, it's just preliminary.
That was a week ago. Right? The number 10 came out a long time ago.
Yeah, right. Like that was in initial negotiations, I think.
Yes.
So,
and I've heard people who I respect say that that's still potentially possible, or was, at the time the season was ending, right around then, because they don't come around very often. They being players who not only are productive, solid now, I would say we can count on him for 25 to 35 goals, but also bring the energy he brings, the ability to get the other team off their game that he brings, the leader that he's become. He brings a lot to the table besides his goals and assists and such. And so people have said to me, agents, I know a couple of GMs, other teams, like those kind of players don't come along very often. You have to be very careful, though, because those kind of players also, because he's not a big guy, but he plays physically, they can age quickly. I mean, some people use Brendan Gallagher as a comp for TK. I think TK is a better all around. He's faster. He's got a little bit better tool set than Gallagher, but small player who goes to the net, gets his nose dirty. They're both that. And, obviously Gallagher signed a contract and has had so many injuries since. So there's always those cautionary tales. But like you said, he's still a young veteran. He's in the middle of his career. If you don't think the Flyers are going to contend until 2035, okay, don't sign him. They're not that far away. They almost made the playoffs last year. They've just added a heck of a prospect. They've got a ton. They've got 3 or 4 really good prospects on the cusp. I mean, Oliver Bonk really is going to be a player. So, I mean, it's not like they're eons and eons away. They're not the Blackhawks who, this year decided they got to go out and get some players to get better. And Detroit's been trying to get these veteran players to get better and go over the hump for a while. And all you can't plan 5 years down the road. If you're planning 5 years down the road, Owen Tippett's too old.
Yeah,
he's going to be 31. So I mean, what are we talking about with this rebuild? Are we talking about, we'll build 5 wins at a time? No, that's not the way it happens. And I think Travis Konecny can absolutely be part of this team when they're contending, and I mean legitimate Stanley Cup contenders. He won't be a young player then. He's not a young player really now. He's a middle-aged NHL player. but he's not going to be old. He's not going to be 35. I mean, if we're talking 8 years from now, before the Flyers finally contend, something went wrong, because that would mean Michkov's almost 30. So we get involved in this rebuild talk like it's so far off that they almost made the playoffs last year. So we'll see how far off it is. But having said that, if the rebuild is 2 or 3 years when you think they're going to be contending, TK is part of it. He's not that old, and he's a big part of the thing. Now, if you sign him for 8 years, you're going to have him into his mid-30s. So those contracts usually don't end well. You can buy him out, obviously, if you get toward the end of it a little, as we see a lot of players having that happen to them. But toward the end of the contract, it might not be a great salary cap hit for you. But you can say that about most contracts signed by players, their second, and starting to turn into their third contracts, because more and more we're seeing players get locked up long-term with their second contracts. What used to be bridge contracts are now the long-term contracts. And, with Slavkovsky and some of these guys who are signing those deals, it's a risk. We still don't know what they're going to be yet. So we know what TK is. And will he be that 8 years from now? Probably not. Father Time loses to no one. But will he be that player in 4 years? I think he'll be pretty close to the same player, unless he just gets beset with injuries, and you can't count on that. You can't see that happening. You hope it doesn't happen.
Can't factor that in. Yeah.
Yeah. So bottom line is, I think he gets signed, but if they're asking for 10 or whatever the number is out there, that's decisions that Danny has to make. I mean, he has to weigh, can we commit that much money to, even if he was a couple of years younger, one player, when we're going to have big contracts? You're hoping Michkov's going to want a big contract at some point because he's playing extremely well, and Forster, and they already got Tippett signed. But I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where the negotiation is. I think TK really wants to play here, so I think that's going to factor in as well. I mean, he's gotten really comfortable here. He's started his family here. I mean, so I think it'll get done. I don't have any inside information on that, but I do think it'll get done.
That's my thought process as well, that the two sides come to some sort of agreement. I think one thing to point out is, I mean, for Konechny, I think he gets treated like he might be a little bit older just because he's been around so long, came into the league so early. But he still is really a young player, only in his mid-20s, essentially entering his prime, in my opinion, of potentially his best years in his career. And one thing really to point out as well is there's so many teams looking for players who play with such an aggressive style and play in the way that Travis Konechny does. If you're the Flyers, you have to be careful because you're trying to ramp up your ability to become, a contender on a yearly basis. Once you trade a player like a Konechny, you're going to be looking for a player like him who does, the things that he does. So why would you remove a guy? Why would you remove a guy in that situation who is already familiar with the team, familiar with the area, just has been here his whole career, and then you're just going to have to replace him anyway. So that's kind of my thought process in terms of, why you would want to re-sign him versus, look to move him or let him walk or something along those lines. Obviously it comes to the point where, if you get to a trade deadline or something like that and there's still nothing signed, maybe, you look to that option. But you have to even think about how many players this past offseason who, did go into the offseason potentially being UFAs and ended up re-signing. So it's not particularly out of the ordinary for that to happen. And then just in terms of the contract specifics, I would think, if you look at Reinhardt's cap hit of 8.625, obviously, you have to factor in the Florida, the no income tax and things like that. But I would imagine the number would be somewhere between 8 and 9 million. Usually with negotiations, that 10 million number that people try to put as gospel that you mentioned, JJ, usually negotiations always start off. Yeah, exactly. Not gospel. They always start off high, right? So it would only make sense for an agent and the player to start off high, and then the team and the player and their agent meet in the middle typically. So I, like you said, personally expect it to get done, but we'll obviously see what happens. But Konechny fits into the Flyers, at least system right now, just the way they play pretty terrifically. So why let a guy like that go?
Yeah, I mean, if you think around the league, how many players that bring all of what we talked about with TK are there? There's not.
Scarce,
I mean, Matthew Tkachuk is a kind of player like that. obviously with higher production in his career. But I'm not just talking about the numbers with TK. It's about
Exactly.
he's the Energizer Bunny. I mean, how many nights were there where he got the team going with a hit or with a dash
A
down the
lot.
ice or with his mouth or with a little get a scrum
It's
going,
hard to
whatever.
quantify that, right?
Yeah, it's hard to, but they are so valuable. And the best point that I've heard from anybody here tonight was what you said. The second they deal him, they begin to search for a new player just like him. So, because there's just not that many, and they're hard to find. I mean, Garnet Hathaway brings that grit, but he's not going to be, a top line player
Right.
on a consistent basis. They're hard to find. Tom Wilson is a big, strong. There's not many Tom Wilsons in the league anyhow. They can play first line, but still bring that physical. In his case, it's an imposing presence. There's not many of Tom Wilsons out there, but there's just not many players even like Travis Konecny enough. I mean, Brad Marchand, again, higher production, but there's just, I can count probably on one hand the kind of players they could be top line players. And I think TK has proven to us he's a top line player and bring all the extra stuff. So that has to weigh in for sure.
Absolutely.
And, Michkov's here as well, 2 years earlier than they expected. Does that impact it? Because now that he's here and that the Cutter Gauthier trade happened and they brought in Jamie Drysdale, who's already an NHL player, does that accelerate the rebuild a little too? You put all three of those factors together. Michkov came early. The Cutter trade brought a guy who's still young, but he's a veteran now, an NHL veteran at least. And now TK's deal comes up. Maybe the rebuild has been accelerated a little bit.
Yeah.
It's still all about the future. Look what they did at the draft. And people complained. I don't know how. Next year's draft is supposed to be really good.
Yeah.
And Danny just put the Flyers with a stockpile in the first two rounds. So I don't see how you can complain about that. They still got a very good prospect in the first round and took some Flyers and some other guys. But next year's draft is the one. They're loaded. They could make a move to go way high. Who knows?
With all the picks they have, you never know, right?
What's that?
With all the picks they have, you just never know what's going to happen.
But they're in a great position there. So, and that is probably a player who doesn't get here or at least have impact for another 2 or 3 years. So that gives you an idea that they're still thinking down the road. But they're also thinking about now, or else they would have just told Matvei, stay over there in Russia,
Sure.
But he's here, and I think TK is going to be a teammate of his. I do.
So yeah, you mentioned rebuild there, and the one thing that we've talked about on this podcast, the rebuild is more than just the players on the ice, right? It's also the rebuild from the leadership standpoint, all the new staff and how that is also kind of a huge impact on where this team is actually going. Because they do have 12 players under the age of 25 right now. They are at least on average, the second youngest team in the NHL going into, theoretically, I guess at this point, going into next season. They are a young team. They do have a lot of promise. There are players here still developing, and even TK is not, he's not an old man. He's kind of entering his prime right now when we're seeing that. How do you kind of look at the leadership of, and let's just pick on Jones and Briere because they're the two names that we tend to point out when we talk about leadership. Obviously, there's other people involved, but how do you kind of look at their tenure so far? You mentioned the draft and how they're kind of planning things. How do you kind of see the first 2 years going so far? Did it meet your expectations? Has it exceeded your expectations?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just over a year.
Sure. Yeah.
I would say they, from the very beginning, said, we're going to be competitive now and great later. And every move they've made has been with that in mind. Sure. People complained last year, the deadline, when they gave up, what was it, a 4th-round pick for Erik Johnson?
Yeah.
And they're saying, oh, see, they're doing it already. No. This team deserved a chance to make the playoffs. They had traded Walker and lost 2 other defensemen to injury right at that time. And 3 other defensemen, really, if you want to count Risto, Drysdale, and Sealer, all got hurt right as they're trading Walkers. So name a team that can lose 4 defensemen and stay afloat. So they go out and get a veteran for a 4th-round pick with all the picks they stockpiled.
Which they kept.
That's not mortgaging, as it turned out. But they didn't mortgage the future with that trade, is what I'm saying. they traded Sean Walker for a first-round pick. That shows you the rebuild is still on.
Yeah.
Because if Walker stays here, I told you earlier about the power play, but if Walker stays here, even with that power play that Rocky Thompson said stunk, I think he said stunk, although it turned into sucked.
Yeah.
In some parlance, but means the same thing.
Yeah.
But anyhow, even with that bad power play, if they kept Sean Walker, I think they make the playoffs. I think that's how important he was.
Yeah, he had a big impact for sure.
Yeah, and if Carter Hart is here the whole year last year, I think they make the playoffs
for sure.
But my overall take on Danny and Jonesy is that their mantra is we're rebuilding. They're not afraid to use the word, but we're staying competitive while we do it. And they were very competitive last year. Could very easily have made the playoffs. We're in a playoff spot for 113 straight days, something like that. So clearly they were competitive last year, and I think they'll be competitive this year. But it's still, when you measure the two, competitive now, great later is the big goal. And they showed with the Provorov trade, they showed with the Walker trade, they showed with what they did at the draft this year. They're still thinking about down the road. Not 10 years down the road, but they're still they really put a lot of stock in next year's draft, and they're now in a great position in next year's draft. And while they did that, they got Michkov and Bonk in last year's first round, and they got Lachenko in this year. So they've still added some players to the pot this year and last year through the draft. So I think it's been a really good start, and they were throwing curveballs. I mean, the Cutter Gauthier thing was a huge curve. Could you imagine the excitement if Cutter was still there? It would be Gauthier and Michkov coming in this year. I think we're probably underplaying what Jamie Drysdale could do for this team if he's healthy.
Yeah.
Big if with him. He's had a lot of injuries early in his career, but we did not see at any point last year the Jamie Drysdale that can move the way he can move and that can be completely free of injury. He had multiple injuries, as we found out. And so it's possible he's a whole different level this year too. He's still a young player. So there's all kinds of reason to see. I mean, they were throwing curveballs, Carter Hart, the Cutter Gauthier thing, and they still managed to keep their eye on the prize down the road while having a team almost make the playoffs. So I don't see how you can look at year one on the ice as anything but a positive in terms of how they handled things. I mean, some negative things happened, but kind of out of their control, right? So, I mean, I don't know the whole Cutter Gauthier story, but from what I'm hearing, and here I shouldn't use that phrase, I guess, but it's like, I'm not sure what the Flyers, Danny and Jonesy never got a chance to talk to him. So what did they do? So that's Cutter's decision, and he's going to have to live with it. And what's the date of their game in Philly? He's going to have to live with it that night for sure, because, the Flyer fans are going to let him know about it. But I will say this about Cutter. I watched his one NHL game. I watched him a lot in college and in the international tournaments. He has potential to be an absolute stud. He really does. I don't like, from what I've heard about his attitude, I didn't like what I heard out of his mouth before the championship game. It came back to bite him there. I didn't like what he said after the World Junior game. Just a little too much cockiness for me and all that. But as a player, he is like, he's big. He's got a tremendous shot. But what he showed me this year was that he can distribute the puck too. So he might be the Rookie of the Year this year. Who knows? Celebrini certainly got a shot at it for sure. It's going to be an interesting race there. The bottom line is, to answer your question, the Flyers lost him, I don't think to any fault of Danny and Jonesy. I don't think they had anything to do with why he was upset in the first place. And then they lost Carter, which is obviously not their fault either. And they still managed to be competitive, make the best of the Cutter thing by getting a quality prospect and a second-round pick, and then manage the draft, manage the Provorov trade, manage the Walker trade to build assets for a great draft. And I don't think you can be critical of that. People are being critical of Danny now, maybe for not lighting the world on fire, setting the world on fire here in the off season. He really didn't have any place to go. The Ryan Ellis contract, the Kevin Hayes leftover, and then now you get the Johansson situation. They've got some dead cap money, so he wasn't going to add a lot of salary now. They weren't going to add old players now anyhow. They're not quite ready for that. So kind of limited what he could do here in the offseason. And then when the Michkov stuff started happening, I'm sure they kind of said, well, that's something. And so we're going to experience that. And there's plenty to be excited about.
Yeah, agreed.
Go ahead, Vasili. Sorry.
I was just gonna say with Briere and Jones and the whole regime taking over, they've really kept to the plan and what they've ascribed to, and kind of promoted, in their press conferences and when they've had media availabilities, they've really stuck to that same idea of we're building for the future, but we're also looking to be competitive at the same time. So it's not the traditional, okay, we want to get super young, let's lose a bunch of games, let's tank. And I think that's the smart way to go about it. If you just look at, past situations, past teams, like look at the Buffalo Sabres. They still haven't made the playoffs in so many years after going through that same situation of let's be the worst team, try to be the worst team in the league, try to have, all these young players on a team. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Even the Edmonton Oilers, really, until they got Connor McDavid, it was the same type of situation. So
even after, I mean,
yeah,
they
exactly.
didn't make it to the finals until his 9th year.
Exactly.
I mean, and the other thing is about the rebuild is I know it was very important to Jonesy is the development side of things. They've completely revamped that side of things. We probably won't be able to tell whether that's working for another year or two at least, but there were good signs last year, and then a lot of players that were called up did make some real contributions. It seemed like for years they'd call up guys from the Phantoms, and the guys would look, overmatched or, just old players that were hanging around kind of thing. Now it really looks like they're gonna, they're developing some depth in the organization simply because players are developing better. That's the hope, at least. So there's that part of the rebuild too that takes certainly a while to show some fruits of the labor. But bottom line is that's a huge part of it. You've got to
Very
draft
important.
and develop, right? And the drafting we all watch. We don't all watch the development as much, and that is something that they're very committed to, and I think they're off to a really good start there too.
Yeah, I think it's good to change. It's good to change things up. Obviously, bring in new people that potentially, offer different opinions, different insights that weren't a part of the staff under the previous regime. So for them to change that just shows, the proactivity that this regime has versus the past, in my opinion. And I really do think, like I was saying, that if you just look at the way that they're approaching things, like Yariv said, right, second youngest team potentially on paper going to next season, but you still look at all the veteran pieces on this team that are there that can help those younger guys, because as we know in the NHL, it can be tough as a young player to kind of get your bearings, understand where you fit in the league. And I think having veterans there to support those young players is really, really important. Whereas a lot of those other situations where teams were geared toward the future, they kind of stripped it back a little too far. And that can hurt your young players in the long run when you don't have those right supports there to help them through those tough situations. So I think
that's a great point. Look at Chicago this year, and I'm some of these teams going out and getting veteran players because
desperately
losing all the time does not help development.
Right.
Definitely not.
It's killer. So let's talk about the future. You referenced it already. I want to talk about this year's draft, and then you referenced already next year's draft. I do want to talk about that, and then we could talk about we can kind of end it on that segment. You mentioned Jet Luchenko. The fan base tends to freak out when things don't go the way they expect. Everybody saw Ziv Boyum. Again, I'm Israeli. He's an Israeli hockey player. I was high on him, plus his reputation and the film I've watched on him. Totally get why people were disappointed. I wanted him as well, right? Like I saw him available, and I thought, let's jump on this guy. Flyers ended up taking Jet Luchenko. I tend to not really care about rankings anymore. And Vasili and I did a whole segment on this last week where we went through the last 14 years of drafting and showed everybody that the pre-rankings almost are completely irrelevant. And if you look back at drafts, really, I think, what was it, Vasili? 8 to 10 players of the top 20 even end up being a top player.
So basically the
draft.
stat was, if you looked at like the last 14 years, essentially players that were selected in the top 10, they didn't even end up, like maybe only 5 or 6 of them ended up actually being top scores of that draft class when you look at it after the fact. So it just shows that they might have been highly touted at the time, but it doesn't always turn out to be that way necessarily. So
so
we're in an information age, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing, unfortunately, in a much more important level how misinformation can really lead to some
Sure.
problems.
Sure.
Well, in sports, there's so much information now in all the sports, even baseball, which the draft in baseball is even more of a crapshoot than hockey.
Yes.
Yeah.
And football, we all see college football. Basketball, we see some college, although it's gotten so much more European now. Basketball, that a lot of people haven't even seen those prospects anymore either. But we're all going, in football, who Mel Kiper likes and who this guy likes, and in hockey, it's Bob McKenzie, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, but he's got his list, and they even send the scouting bureau rankings out, and McKean's. There's a whole bunch of them out there. They all, there's the guy for the Athletic with all vowels in his name. And they all have it all figured out. They have the draft all figured out, right? And we never hold them to task on. I'm glad you guys did that, because after the fact, the day of the draft or the day after the draft, they'll give out their grades based upon what they thought they should do. Well, I trust scouts who actually have their eyes on these guys for like 3 years, 4 years. I trust them more than I trust some writer or some guy who's seen them once on a.
Well, that's my perspective as well, right? Like the scouts are employed to do this, and they've been watching it for years at a time.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so we all overreact in all sports to these drafts based upon these prognostications, which for the most part are from people who haven't even seen them play that much. And I'm fully guilty. I wanted the Flyers to draft Cutter Gauthier so bad 2 years ago. I'd never seen him play, but I wanted to. Why? Because I read the scouting report on him, and I read a couple of people who had seen him play, and he seemed like he
fun
fit
in the
exactly
moment, right around draft time and things like that.
Yeah.
So,
but I didn't interview him. The Flyers have interviewed all these kids. And unfortunately with Cutter, they didn't see apparently the cockiness, but with some of these players, things jump out in those interviews that none of these prognosticators are ever going to get close to. So we just put too much influence on hey, it's fun. It brings attention to the sport. It's fun to watch the draft. But then to come out with these grades the day after the draft is I'd love to. What you should really do that again, what you guys did, but go back and find the grades after the draft from all the people and see how far off they were.
And then really grade them, right?
Yeah, and then grade them. Because it's just because there is information out there now, and you can get clips of just about every player. I don't think you can judge a player on clips. It's like I coach broadcasting, and that would be like judging a broadcaster on just his goal call or just it's how you handle the game, right? That's how a player is too, how he handles the game. So if you show, him dance around 3 guys and score a goal, you're gonna say, "Wow, this guy's a real prospect." Well, no, maybe he doesn't even know how to where his own zone is.
How did he handle the situation when it got tough, right? That's what you don't see.
Yeah.
So.
And the scouts see that. Scouts see the playoffs. Scouts see them. They see body language, which is something that in clips you're not going to see that much of. I've always told when my son played, I said, watch your body language when you're going back to the bench, things like that. You're always being watched, and it doesn't look good to the coach. Doesn't look good to anybody if you're, slumping your shoulders or. And I know Jonesy's big on that. He doesn't like when players show frustration when they can't score. I mean, Tyson Forster early last year was snake bitten, right? He had like 6 posts and couldn't get that first goal, and eventually he finally did one of those look to the heavens. And I remember right away saying, they're not going to like that. And Torch brought it up in the post game. He's starting to show frustration. Can't do that. And shortly thereafter, he scored, and then he scored like 8 goals in 7 games. But I mean, it's a lot of things you see in person. You talk to the players. I trust the scouts more than I trust any of these prognosticators. So yeah, when Luchenko's name was called, there's this uproar or whatever. To your point, another small defenseman was not really what the Flyers needed. I mean, the Flyers have Cam York's not huge. Jamie Drysdale. You're talking about Emil Andre is in the system. They've got kind of that whole thing covered. Smallish defenseman.
And we asked Danny that at the draft. Like we asked him, did that factor into your selection? He said, absolutely, right? Like, look at how thin we are at center. This is why we went for the center, which if you're looking at, people will say always, you shouldn't draft by need, but in this situation, it did make a lot of sense. So I understand it from that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, there are those out there who say you always draft the best athlete when you're picking in the first round. But I'll tell you this: going to development camp, Jet Lachenko can flat out fly. First of all, now there's been a lot of players who can flat out fly that don't make it to the NHL. He's also smart. In the scrimmage,
that's what's
he
really
made
important.
Some
too.
unbelievably subtle plays for a 17-year-old, 18. I mean, he's so young. He's got that hockey IQ already, and he's got legs like that. That might end up being the best pick of that first round. It might, I mean, because no one expected him to go there. Those are the ones that turn out to be the best ones, right? We'll see. He's got to get stronger, obviously. But I had no problem with the pick because I am not pick the best athlete available all the time. If you got two guys who are even, in different positions, you got to take the position where your organization has need. If you've got a guy who you think's head and shoulders above, maybe you thought that. I personally didn't think that he was that great. He had how many defensemen picked before him?
Right.
At least 4 or 5,
seven?
yeah.
I mean, come on. If there's 4 or 5 defensemen picked before you, are you really that much better? So, and he's a good player. He's had a great career already and great
I
kid.
admit I was
everything
biased.
I've read about him is great. I don't mean to shoot him down at all. I'm just saying I want they need centers and Lachenko.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I think they had him a lot higher rated, obviously, than the experts. But I think some other teams were we're definitely with the Flyers on that. So,
Mr. Perfect Patrice Bergeron was taken in the second round, right? And that's a
defensive. There's certain skills. There's certain skills I think you got to highlight, like what you mentioned specifically, JJ, like the skating in this new NHL is huge, but also the hockey IQ. I think that's one of the biggest things that people always underrate because it's hard to see it initially, right? Or it's hard to always pinpoint it. But like if you can think the game at a high level, that's really where a lot of your opportunities come from. If you know the right places to go, you have that hockey sense to get to those specific areas, find those soft spaces. I think that's really like a huge thing for a lot of teams that I think, like to your point, these prognosticators might not even really factor in a lot of the time.
There's no way. You have to see a player a lot to really know if their IQ is. I mean, I can go to one game and have an idea, but maybe he wasn't feeling well. And,
you need at least 15, 20 games.
Yeah, these scouts see these players so much, and the Flyers have also revamped that, the scouting department. So, I mean, I have more confidence, and Brett Flair's a very good hockey guy. He knows his stuff.
Has been since Minnesota with the drafting. Done a great job there.
He's been good here, I mean, for the most part. And to me, it's like I was not worried about where he was ranked. Once I saw him at development camp, I absolutely understand why they picked him that high. It was one of those things when he showed up, they thankfully have put names and numbers now on the players for the development camp for the last couple of years, but I didn't need it. I walked in, there was one guy who was clearly faster than anybody else. And that was in the drills. You can't tell much through drills other than just skills, right? But then when the scrimmage happened, that's when I noticed in traffic, little touch passes, where he was going on the ice. And that's only from a scrimmage. I would have to see him. I can only imagine when things are more competitive, that he ramps it up more. But the other thing is when it gets more competitive, he's going to get hit more. And that's the thing he's got to work on. He's not a big guy. So, he's not thick. I think he's got a frame he can definitely add to. And be, Mike Richards wasn't the biggest guy, but I wouldn't say he played small. So you could be, Mike Richie wishes he had Lachenko's wheels. So it's just it's going to be that pick did not bother me in the least. That Danny again. The media's got to like Danny. He's very forthright.
Very
not many
transparent.
GMs would come out and say that.
Yeah,
they really would. They say, "Oh, we had him where we picked him." That's the state.
Right. Yeah.
Well, even for the off season, right? Like a lot of fans were clamoring for Briere to make a lot of moves, and he stated in both his press conferences pre-draft and after day 1 and 2, when we talked to him, well, don't expect much, and there hasn't been much, right?
Well,
so he's been very forthcoming for sure.
We kind of laugh at that, but it's vital.
Yeah.
Given what had happened, with his predecessor, who I love. Chuck Fletcher as a guy. He's a
really nice
tremendous human
person.
being,
Yeah.
and saved my butt in one particular situation. But I mean, he went out at one point and said, "We're in an aggressive retool," and then he didn't do anything. And then he said, "We're going to be sellers," and he didn't sell JVR. And there were just these mixed messages, right? So you're not getting mixed messages from Danny. He says, "We're open for business," makes the Provorov trade. He says, "Going to be quiet off season." Obviously, Michkov's making a lot of noise, but as far as any trades and stuff and big free agent signings, it's been a quiet off season. So he's on in terms of his messaging, that's for sure.
Yeah, really well put. We kind of try to give Chuck Fletcher a little more credit here because people want to diminish everything he did. I don't think he had a great performance as a GM here, but he was not completely incompetent either. He did again. We bring up the Giroux trade that was very, very good, especially the position that he was in.
No question.
Yeah.
Right now it's Giroux, 1 month of Giroux or a month and a half of Giroux for Owen Tippett, Denver Barkey, and a first round pick in next year's draft.
Yeah, so it looks pretty good just on the forefront there, right?
Yeah, I mean that was Chuck, and obviously we could talk about some of the bad moves he made. The moves that got him in trouble were ones where he was trying to keep them competitive, but the Tony D'Angelo trade and some of these things. But it's just, I mean, you wonder what would have happened if Matt Niskanen hadn't retired. The dominoes that fell from that, it's just unbelievable.
It was a completely different situation.
It was never.
And trying to replace him, they made quite a few mistakes. And then, of course, not anything that Chuck could control, or the Ryan Ellis situation. I mean, if Ryan Ellis had been Ryan Ellis that he had been his whole career, Chuck might still be the GM. I mean, I know it's not wise. We said earlier, one player doesn't make a team, but when you put that much into getting a player and then get 4 games out of them,
it has a negative
no
impact.
fault of your own. That's tough. Yeah,
Same thing happened with Chris Pronger. I mean, I'm not putting Niskanen on Chris Pronger's level, but again, as soon as the team lost Pronger, they completely spiraled after that.
Well,
never found
they tried to make up for that.
Tried to replace
Shea Weber.
Yeah.
Right.
If Shea Weber, if that goes through, that deal goes through, and he comes here, Paul Holmgren might still be the GM.
Yeah.
It's just the ifs and ands and buts of it all, right? But yeah, Chuck's a longtime hockey guy and just a superhuman being, and does take more heat. I envision if the Flyers do go on and the pick they get next year, and let's say Barkey becomes a player and Tippett's already a player, you start using, they had Wade call if the Flyers go on to being successful. Oh, look, Chuck Fletcher laid the groundwork with some of those moves. He had some decent drafts too. So it's always in hindsight that way.
Yeah, for sure. So let's end on this. You mentioned it earlier, the Flyers' upcoming draft this offseason, and I think this has always been at least somewhat part of the plan. I think they anticipated that this draft would be a huge draft for them, especially after grabbing Michkov and, noticing that, that this year would be not a bad draft, but not like a spectacular draft. And then they kind of saw the writing on the wall. The Flyers right now have 6 picks inside the top 64, theoretically, probably 5 within the top 50, something like that. I can't remember a time I've seen that many picks from the Flyers that high in the draft. Not in all the years I've been watching them, at least. So at least 25 to 30 years, as far as I can recall. I haven't really seen anything like this. It's pretty exciting. And, looking at the top of that draft, we did some previews for it already. There is a top center, not just Higgins at the very top, but there are top centers available in that top 10. And maybe the Flyers will be in a position to grab one of them, especially if they, we talked about it earlier, package, try to move up. I think that is their window to be aggressive. What do you think about that upcoming draft? Do you think the Flyers have kind of built around that decision-making? Because if you look at the salary cap and how it eases up, not just next year, but also the following year, they do kind of, when I look at a rebuild, I look at it as looking for your windows. And I think that's where Chuck Fletcher made a mistake, is he was aggressive when the window didn't call for it, where you have to wait for your window. And I think that's what the Flyers are doing. And I think they've kind of opened themselves up to, being patient, locking up, taking up a bunch of picks, and then waiting for that window, which could be and probably another year and a half. When their cap starts opening up and they can sell off whatever remaining pieces they have. But that draft looks to be a big deal. Have you recalled anything like that from the Flyers, and how do you feel about like not even just this season, but like the next off season and potentially that following year being the year that we could see that big move in the free agency or that big trade that a lot of fans are kind of waiting for?
Well, I mean, these guys have said, and again, they've been men of their word so far, that the players will tell them when the window is officially open and that they can actually go out and maybe acquire a veteran player via free agency or a trade. If they take 2 or 3 steps back this year, which could happen. I mean, are untested in goal. We don't know about Coots. Hopefully his physical situation's good. Michkov, how does the transition go? So there's plenty of question marks around this team. If they do take 2 steps back, then no, I don't think the window's going to be open that quickly. If, let's say, they take a step forward and they make the playoffs this year, and Michkov does become a factor, and Ersson does prove he's a number one, or one of their goalies. They've got a couple options now. If things go right, maybe it's accelerated to that. The bottom line is it's a really good deep draft, and they have a lot of picks. That's never a bad place to be. Whether they go at that and stockpile a whole bunch of prospects to just fortify and become the team with the best, prospect list in the league, which they probably would be pretty close to becoming if Michkov had not come over and then they made all those picks. Michkov will no longer be a prospect, so their list is going to drop off just because of that. But having said that, if you look at the situation, they could either draft a whole bunch of players or they can trade some of them to get maybe a guy they think is another major impact player. I don't want to say generational or franchise player. They're just weird terms to me, but another really good player that's going to be a big piece of your future. Then they have the wherewithal to do that. You can't draft all high picks because they're all going to come to their entry level at the same time, and you're going to end up with a salary cap mess. You got to kind of stagger it a little bit. So my guess is maybe they trade some of them and move up or whatever, but we'll see. I mean, it depends on where they're picking, where the great players that they like that might not necessarily be on the boards of the people we see, where they are when they come to pick. And if they see one of their guys that might go, maybe they trade up. That's so far off, we don't even know where they're picking yet. So they're just in a good spot. You have a lot of picks in a good draft. It's not, there's no way you can say it's a bad spot to be in. And you're throwing that on top of a good prospect pile already, on top of the second youngest team in the league that almost made the playoffs. So if you do the math, they're not, in my mind, they're not that far away.
That's my thought process as well. When you look at the draft, like they put themselves in a very good position with 6 picks in the first 2 rounds, essentially. And we don't know, obviously, where they're picking. We don't know where this team's going to finish next year, but it just opens you up to so many different opportunities when you have those assets and you're really not tied into too much yet in terms of like long-term deals coming up, especially to young players or anything like that, right? Like if you do think, and this team takes that next step and the players kind of show that and they make the playoffs, the Flyers might have a totally different perspective versus if they took a couple of steps back, right? Where they might have wanted to take all those picks. Let's say if the players take that step forward, they might say, well, we will pick, some of those, or we will take some of those first round picks, make those selections, but we might use some of that draft capital to make a trade or add, a potential roster player that we think could really fill a need or help us out right now in the here and now. And then we always say this on the podcast from week to week that you have to follow the money, right? Like you look at this off season, they had minimal cap space. They weren't just going to trade players to free up cap space to then try to sign free agents or trade players and have other teams take on money. That's very difficult to do. So you look at Briere, you look at Jones and what their thoughts are. And my perspective and my thought process is next season, you have $25 million of cap space opening up. The following season, you have about $46 million of cap space opening up. That will be the time, right, to see those free agency type of moves to potentially make trades because just the flexibility is there. It's really hard when you're cash strapped right now, especially in the NHL in a cap strapped league, right?
Yeah. I mean, in a perfect world, they make the playoffs either next year, this coming season, or the year after that, right as that opens up. So then you're adding to already a contending playoff team.
Exactly.
If they take a couple steps back this year and finish down near the bottom, good news is they're going to have a high pick in a really, really good draft. The bad news is you're that much further from contention. So personally, I only have so many years left as a broadcaster. I hope it's the former, not the latter, that they're taking the step forward this year, but it might not happen. And the Flyers are not concerned about me being around. That's for darn sure. So it's they want to obviously do this right, but as you say, and as they've said, the win-loss record or how the team's played, how the team is put together, will probably determine how they move. It certainly will determine what they do at the trade deadline. Again, if they're in the mix, let's say in the mix in the playoffs, they were this past year, but they were starting to slip at that point. If they're solidly in a playoff spot next year, in March, what do you do? I mean,
they might want to build on that, right? So
you probably need a center, right? Unless somebody comes out of Ryan Poehling shows that he's absolutely a third line center who can score 20 goals and do everything. Then and that could happen. He did 12 or 13 last year. So, but I mean, and Frost and Couturier, as we talked about, take the positive steps. There's a lot of ifs we're throwing out there, but if all that happens, you can add that center because you need 4 or 5 centers to go into the playoffs. So,
sure.
Yeah, this is all conjecture at this point, but first things first, just got to get the young kid mixed in, the mad Russian, and just get that all settled. See how training camp goes. They started the year out west. They'll have a bonding circumstance out west, I'm sure, because they're starting with. I think
the first 5 games or 4 games are at 10 p.m.
Yeah, I think the first 4 on the trip, maybe a 5th row game after that is closer to home, but I know it's Vancouver, Seattle, Calgary, Edmonton, I think, to start. Not in that order, but those 4 teams, they started in Vancouver. Whistler might be back again. I know that's what we did when we started in Vancouver not too long ago. Actually, we didn't start in Vancouver. We started in Calgary. I think that we played Calgary
a few years back.
Then went to Vancouver and had like 5 days off between games, so they went to Whistler for a bonding.
Hey, that's great bonding for a young team. But it'll be interesting ultimately, right? Like at the end of the day, it's a very young team that took positive steps last season. You're adding a really potentially talented player in Matvei Michkov. So I think the possibilities could be endless on how many steps this team takes forward and what they ultimately do this season. So it'll be really interesting. But I think it's just going to be a fun season for the fans coming up, just to see how Michkov integrates and kind of how this all progresses with the rebuild here.
Yeah, I mean, we still want to see what steps Tyson Forster takes. Does Tippett reach another level? So there's all kinds of Cam York. I mean, he really took big strides. Another stride for him might be all-star level play. Sanheim, can he carry over what he had for much of last season? And Jamie Drysdale. I mean, again,
how does he perform?
Really
now that he's
surprised.
Healthy,
yeah,
right?
I mean, if he's healthy, everybody who's seen him play when he's healthy says he's like dynamic. So,
well, I remember watching him at the World Juniors when he played there, and I thought like he was their best defenseman for Canada on the ice considerably for a lot of shifts. So he hasn't been healthy for a lot of his NHL career. So now that he finally is, I'm very interested to see how that skating and dynamic ability of his game factors in.
Yeah, so Michkov obviously is what everybody's going to be watching, but there's a lot of other things to watch too. It should be a fun season.
Yeah, should be great. All right, let's end it on that. Jim, thank you so much for coming on. We talked about this earlier. You have a broadcasting school that you've been on here for a few years already. We've talked about it every single time. You want to just let people know what to do if they're interested in signing up, taking your classes and continuing their education.
Yeah, I mean, it started when I got my summers off, starting in 2021, really. And I figured I got to do something. So I started broadcast coaching And it's basically a program where I have different programs, one-on-ones where I do 3 Zooms with you and run through. I tailor make it to whatever you want. It's not just play-by-play. It's sideline reporting. I've had a couple of analysts. I've had some anchors, sports talk show hosts, radio talk show hosts. I've even had just podcasters. So it's just all sports broadcasting. And I'm your mentor for life after that, as long as you want me. Let's put it that way. I don't cling to you, but if you want me, you've got me. For some, a shadow opportunity, and that's the one-on-one program, and it's for ages 12 to 59. That's the span. I've had a 59-year-old, I've had a couple of 12-year-olds. So I tend to get a lot of 20-somethings who are just out of school or still in school, but I've had several, and I've had some graduate to good jobs. One's on CBS right now. So it's been very rewarding. This summer, I decided to go back to having group sessions, which are 3-hour Zooms, and it's obviously group. It's a bunch of people, and I had one last week, but I had a couple people, more than a couple, 3 or 4, that said that date didn't work for them. So I'm gonna have another one on August the 17th, which is a Saturday. I'm gonna move it to the weekend and move it to the morning. It was a weekday, mid-afternoon last month. I figured I'll try to change the time and day and make it for mainly the people who couldn't go to the last one, but obviously anybody else who hadn't heard of the last one. And I have a website, jimjacksonbroadcasting.com. On that website, there is a link to the actual group broadcast Zoom on there. There's also a link to my coaching program in general and a whole bunch of other stuff too. But those are the 2 you'd be looking at. And I do a lot in the summer, but I still keep doing it even into the season. Not as heavily, obviously, a little busy, but I do as much as I can. But that camp, the 17th, wide open. I just opened it up yesterday. So I'm not expecting a huge group because I had a big group for this one last week, but I'm just opening it up so everybody gets a chance. And I talk about my path to where I am and the lessons I learned. I talk about finding your niche in the business. We talk about broadcast fundamentals, a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, Q&A. It was a 3-hour Zoom scheduled last week. It ended up, you guys won't be surprised to hear this, 4 hours, as we were supposed to go, I think, 45 minutes, and we're now working on an hour and a half. It's like, that's just, I don't cut it off. They were asking questions, and I said I'm going to answer every question, so it ended up going 4 hours, but scheduled for 3 hours, and we cover a lot of stuff. So welcome anybody who's got a passion for sports broadcasting and wants to learn and try to get better.
Awesome. Yeah, and make sure to check that out. We're going to put a link to the site in the description of this video. Also, if you're reading the article, of course, it'll be there as well. Definitely want people to learn from you. Sounds great. All right. Again, thank you, Jim. Really appreciate you coming on, and looking forward to have you on again in the future.
Always great talking Flyers hockey.
Yeah, thank you.
Definitely. Thanks again.
Let the is it going to be Matvei Mania or Michkov Mania? But
I think it's got to be Michkov Mania. Someone's going to have a T-shirt out there with it.
I'm pretty sure PHLY and Bill Matz and Charlie O'Connor already have the Michkov Mania shirts going on.
They beat us to it.
Bill will probably have Mad Russian Mania because he loves using that. But I something's got to give there. Mania is just dying to be used. So because there is a mania for sure. But as we were saying, give the kid a little time. It's gonna, there's a lot on his plate right now.
Yeah, well said. All right. Cool. All right. So we had a great conversation with Jim. Went longer than we anticipated.
Always a fun time to talk to him, though.
Yeah. He was great to have on. Really, really enjoyed having Jim on. And again, make sure to check out his broadcasting school. Again, the link will be in the description of this video. And also, if you found this video through the article that's written for each episode we release, it'll be in that as well. So he said a lot of really interesting things. Like the one thing that stuck out to me the most when we were talking about like Cutter Gauthier, he was talking about how locked up Keith Jones managed to keep everything. And if you look at the Rutger McGroarty situation that has been going on with the Winnipeg Jets, and how like apparently they had a trade in the works and the team nixed it because of the attitude problems, and you saw how this like public display of this drama is so much worse than what we experienced with Cutter Gauthier, where like there was some speculation, but very minimal, and everybody was anticipating him to like be on his way over here, and then one day there's just like a trade. And not only that, they got a high end prospect in return, one with NHL experience in Jamie Drysdale, and a second round pick on top of that in next year's stronger draft. And just retrospectively, after talking to Jim and like hearing the way that the Flyers are just executing on keeping things internally, he even mentioned that with the TK news that TK could be signed any day and we won't see it coming.
Yeah.
I think he's pretty spot on there. And I think there's so much power in that control over your message. We talk about leverage all the time on this podcast. And look at how little leverage the Winnipeg Jets have right now with Rucker McGroarty. They're between a rock and a hard place, and their audience knows it. Every team knows it now. I just feel like they find themselves in a really bad place, and I think it is a reflection on how well things are running right now for the Flyers, especially when you look at the way the Flyers treated Matvei Michkov to show up at the airport waiting for him. Like, think about what Cutter walked away from. I mean, this is a team that clearly would have gone the extra mile for this kid, and he didn't even have from what we understand, the respect to even talk to them, which only makes me not care about his performance even more and how we really don't want a guy like that here. Sorry,
also, Yariv, to your point, like when has there really been leadership like that? Like we talked about it with JJ a bit. Like when have we ever seen a leadership group like go to the airport to greet a prospect before? Like
never.
I can't. Yeah, I don't think I've ever personally seen it. So it's just really interesting. It just shows, the qualities that Jones and Briere possess. They're willing to go above and beyond for their players, obviously, if they warrant that. And I think to your point, like with all the just the Flyers Cutter Gauthier situation, none of that news really leaking, and in general, just the Flyers, they seem to be right now as a management group, like things are very sealed and it's very tightly sealed to the point where you're not really hearing much information when it comes to Flyers moves, what they might be doing, in terms of negotiations with players. Whereas like the prior regime with Chuck Fletcher, I feel like we were hearing things all the time. So it's just a credence to them to be able to keep these things under wraps, obviously. And I think it's definitely a benefit to business in general, because even in everyday business outside of hockey, in general business, like when companies are doing business with one another, you don't want certain details of negotiations, contract negotiations to leak out, to public places, public spheres. And I think that probably helps the Flyers down the line with other teams because they know that they're dealing with an entity that is not going to leak information. Typically, if there is anything leaked, like with that St. Louis trade, that St. Louis like failed Sanheim trade a couple of years ago, all that stuff came from the St. Louis side. So I really do think like operating in that manner has a lot of value for you, like as an organization. And even with this Konechny stuff that Jim mentioned as well, like who knows what the two parties and the two camps are negotiating. Like they could be talking every single day for all we know, but obviously the way that this management staff is operating, we wouldn't know that they would be talking. And I think that's probably a good thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like it makes me think about Kolosov as well, and like, the rumors that came out of Belarus and how that's not from our side. And, I see people already talking about like Danny Briere's failures are Cutter, Gauthier, and Kolosov. And I'm like, well,
but the Kolosov stuff's not even finished yet. So how can you deem it a failure?
Exactly. It's like people are like, oh, they hold his rights. He as far as
they have
Flyers
a contract with
and the NHL goes, they hold his rights, and that they don't have to walk away from that deal at all. Kolosov can't just walk away from that deal. He could try, but the Flyers still hold his rights. Now and I talked about this before, they could opt to give him another year over there, but no matter what, he's still their goalie, and he's not an NHL goalie yet. So while people were talking about him like expecting to come over here and playing, and you brought up that great point where like, he like went to Lehigh Valley, wasn't even starting there. That still was like probably all told to him from the beginning is like, nobody's walking into this team and getting like the crown handed to them.
Yeah,
The
you have to
closest
earn
thing
it,
to that is,
obviously.
yeah, the closest thing is Michkov, which
And
we
we all
know.
know with Tortorella, there's going to be a process of having to earn his ice time, earn that power play time. He's not going to be given to him right
Yeah.
off the bat, most likely.
Yeah, and if Kolosov really is that good, he should be able to come into the AHL and take that spot from Peterson, and that would be his spot to take. I don't think
Well,
that really has to do with the Flyers, though. I think a lot of it is him not necessarily knowing if he even wants to be in North America. And if that's the case, I don't know how you throw that on the GM, but I love that they kept that quiet. Even if it came out of Belarus, they have not made any announcements that he's done here. There's still plenty of time for them to fix that situation in any capacity they can. So, like, with everything I've seen and how they're operating, I almost like still have faith in them that they can remedy that.
well, yeah, the situation's not over and done with, right? There's still a lot to
Right.
monitor and a lot to see. So it's still a while before training camp. I think, at least for Kolosov, you have to be more concerned, right? When it gets closer to training camp, if there's still no signs of him potentially coming over, then that's the time to obviously be concerned. But there's still an ample amount of time for
Yeah.
things to be worked out. So,
Yeah, and then another thing we were talking about with Jim, like the relationship with Torts and Michkov. Now I know that he's just speaking from a place of like, hey, I don't know. This could be, and he brought up a great point with like him, always being like the best player on his team, essentially. But like the situation he left, and we brought this up before, the situation he left in Ska, like they were playing him 3 minutes a night.
Rottenberg was a very tough coach. He even
Right.
scratched him. So
I
he's kind of been through the ringer there, right?
right. Yeah. I don't think again, I don't know the kid at all, and we haven't even seen him over here, but I don't he
Seems
doesn't
competitive, very competitive.
but
So,
he doesn't come off like the type of guy who will be bitter.
yeah.
That's not I what I see
Well,
more from him is more of like that Kobe Bryant mentality where he expects everybody to work as hard as he does.
yeah,
Um,
and then we'll get potentially mad at teammates if he sees them underperforming because he knows that they're not trying
right,
or
which
putting
is
forth the same effort, which
That's like
was what.
Kobe and Jordan and
Yeah. And
most of the
also
greatest players of all
a lot
time.
of stories we saw that came out of Russia, and shout out to Alex Appleyard because he tweeted this stuff out and did some translating earlier this season and earlier like this past year. But a lot of the teammates essentially were saying that, Michkov's very competitive. He's a really good teammate. Like the frustration is more just for the fact that he thinks certain guys could be giving more or, could have like contributed more and things like that. And as a young player, I think that's something to learn, right? Obviously, that not everybody might have the same mentality as you. There might be other ways to approach things versus
Yeah.
like doing it the way that he might have done at that age, that particular time. One thing I always think is important to factor in with Michkov is, you look at Bedard and you look at Michkov. It was really Bedard and Michkov 1-2 going into that draft up until probably like 6, 7 months beforehand with all the geopolitical, situations and happenings in Russia and things like that. And you look at Michkov and he outscored, Bedard at the Gretzky Holinka the previous summer going into that draft. Like that's nothing to balk at when you're outscoring the guy that went number one in the draft in the same tournament, obviously. So that's something to really consider. But I think for Michkov and just his motivation this season, I don't think he forgets that all these teams passed up on him. And I don't think he forgets that he dropped to 7 for certain reasons. My understanding, like when you look at it and how competitive he is, like I truly believe that probably puts a chip on the kid's shoulder where he's like, I dropped to 7. I'm going to show you why that was a big mistake. And
Yeah.
I think he's such a competitor that that chip on the shoulder will probably come in handy. Like he might have a mentality where look at these teams, they passed up on me. They shouldn't have done that. Like I want to prove them wrong. So that can always, be a big factor, right?
Sure.
Like that internal motivation for him. So I'm really interested to see how he performs. Like obviously what JJ
Yeah.
mentioned with the defensive game, like that's going to be true. Like I don't think he's going to be a
That's the
world
case
beater
with
or anything defensively.
all of these guys, though, bring
Exactly,
this
right.
up.
And I
There
think
are no. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
when you're such an offensive player like that, like there's going to be leeway there. And I think Tortorella's the perfect guy to have as a coach because he's that guy that is such a good defensive coach. You'd want a young offensive phenom like that learning the defensive game from a mind like Tortorella and
Yeah.
Bradshaw. So I see it as a real benefit for him, not really something to be concerned about. And the one thing is like if you look at the power play and the Flyers power play being last in the league the past 3 seasons, like I think that's where Michkov's really going to show his talent. really show that he can be like an offensive weapon is that power play with extra time and space. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Flyers utilize him on the power play and where they utilize him exactly, and whether it's like behind the net primarily or they have him on a half wall. I'm real interested to see what they do with him on the power play.
Yeah, man, I can't wait to see him on the power play. And you know, we were talking about the young guys. Like, there's only a handful of players that come into the NHL and are able to play, like at that young of an age, at 18, 19 years old, are able to play a competent defensive game. And one of them is on our team. Sean Couturier walked into the NHL, was able to shut down Malkin at 18 years old, 19 years
Doesn't
old.
happen often.
That's why he won a Selkie. Like, these guys, he is elite defensively. He's been elite defensively since he was like 19 years old. That is very rare. Sasha Barkov is one of those guys. Patrice Bergeron was one of those guys. Even Pavel Datsyuk took time to become the defensive stalwart that he became. Arguably the best two-way player, you know, in the league at the time. Probably better than Patrice Bergeron, at least overall as a player. But again, being that guy who is elite offensively and elite defensively, it takes time to build your game. But the other thing about Torts, so I rewatched Miracle again. I rewatched that movie like periodically.
What a movie though, right?
It's, in my opinion, it is by far the best hockey movie, and there is no close second.
That and Slapshot, but two different types of movies.
Okay, I like Slapshot, but if you're talking about hockey as a sport and how it's representative, there is no better representation of hockey as a sport than Miracle.
Slapshot's like, more of a comedy. Like, it's supposed to be funny, right?
Right.
Like,
I'm not talking down on the movie because, like, I enjoy The Mighty Ducks, which is like a kids movie. I love Mystery Alaska.
Who doesn't love Gordon Bombay?
Right.
You know.
But like, they don't articulate what the game really is anywhere close to what Miracle does. Like, whoever created Miracle loved hockey.
They go in depth,
right?
X's and O's, all that stuff.
So, and not only that, just the mindset of a coach and how they research Herb Brooks. So the reason I'm bringing this up is when you watch that movie and you watch the relationship Herb Brooks has with the players, and one, he's like, we're going to be the most in shape team in the league. The attention to detail, the getting, you know, not being their friend and being the guy who pushes them. That is John Tortorella. Like, that is John Tortorella in a nutshell. And
he embodies a lot of that. So
and in the beginning, you know, they all fight it. There are players that argue against it. They're like, we don't know what the hell this guy's talking about. Like, he's working them to death, and none of them are used to it. And by the end of that movie, and again, this is based off of actual history and interviews with the players. And there are documents.
He brought them together,
right? But there are documentaries about all this. It's not that he just brought them together. He completely evolved these guys as players by pushing them in that direction and showing them what it took to actually compete with the best players in the league. And it's not nice. And it's not this like new school of like, it is that guy. You need to be that guy to get people to go further. And I think when you look at a guy like Michkov and you look at the Russian team in that, they had a very, very tough coach. The expectations for that team were so high. Their conditioning.
Yeah, well, think about the winning that they did. Think about the winning that team did before that point, right? Like, they did not lose, basically.
But that's the culture that Michkov is coming from. Also,
agreed.
I'm not saying it's the same culture that it was, you know, today that it was back then. But like, I do think he will.
It's hard nosed for sure,
right? Yeah. He will understand Tortorella's attitude. And I think a lot of players, if you don't make that attitude, and we brought this up before, a lot of those guys who don't buy into Tortorella, I think Matt Zuccarello is the only one who Torts wasn't high on and ended up having a great career beyond that. But typically, Torts is probably right about you if you don't want to put in that extra mile, that extra gear, where Panarin does. And I think the Michkov to Panarin comparables are probably at least
that's a really good one.
Yeah, are pretty close. So if you guys haven't watched that movie, watch it. And I think you'll understand John Tortorella a little bit better and why they call him like this dinosaur, which I think is a complete line of bullshit. I think that's how you need to be. And I think all of the best coaches in the league are very tough on their team.
Oh, I totally agree. And one thing to add as well, just with like young players like a Bedard, like a Michkov, even like a McDavid coming in, guys that like are really skilled offensively, but might not have everything put together defensively. One thing I always take into account is those guys have really high hockey IQ. When you have that hockey sense, that hockey IQ, that defensive game, it's easy to add in when you think the game so well and you understand where to be on the ice and where to go. So I don't have really concerns there, right? Like that he won't be able to adapt because I think he's such a smart player that it eventually comes with time. Once you play in a league, you kind of know where to position yourself, where to go. But to your point, like in that Miracle talk, makes me want to watch Miracle now for the podcast.
Dude, you should, you should, and we can talk about it again. But it's it's one of those things where like I think a lot of people like look at the way John Tortorella was, and Jim alluded to this, right? He really wanted to make the playoffs. He pushed them hard.
Well,
to the
think
point
about
where,
the experience that gives to your players and your team, right?
well, of course, but he also, I think he hates losing too, but he pushed them really hard, and he had to even go like, all right, well, let me take a step back here. I'm pushing these guys. Like he knows what he's doing. You
Of
know, it
course.
might make people uncomfortable. It might have made the players uncomfortable.
But that's the point of it.
Right. And that's also doesn't mean he lost the room because he made them uncomfortable. Because think about like what was learned over this past year. Again, you have a really young roster
Yeah.
who has already been pushed by this like hocky maniac.
How do
You
they
know what I mean?
react to that, right? Like, how do
Right.
they react to
How do
Tortorella
they go
pushing
into
them,
this season?
knowing that that happened, and how do they, use that also to learn from and react next time in a similar situation?
And
So
also, was he wrong about anything he said?
I
No, people might
don't
not
really
like the
think
way
so.
he said it, but he was not wrong about the things that he said. He was pointing out truths harshly and pushing them. And yes, he got them to that wall. And again, they had injury problems and all that. I think he started realizing, hey, look, they're giving me their all, and I'm beating them up. Let me take the foot off the pedal. I think he
That's
knows
kind of
that.
what we saw the last little bit after that losing streak. I think he realized and
Yeah.
kind of took his foot off the gas a bit. But I do totally agree that like it's a learning experience and it's a good thing to see a coach do that to your team, especially one so close to making the playoffs, because you can see how players react, and it might be an evaluator in a sense. Like, hey, this guy didn't react the way we wanted to. Maybe he shouldn't be here moving ahead. And maybe, obviously we haven't seen a lot of subtractions this offseason, but it might roll into the next
Well,
season where
what does that tell you though?
yeah, do you want that guy there? Is that person gonna be able to be a
Well,
part of a winning culture? So
I mean the Flyers didn't get rid of anybody.
yeah, which shows they might like how the players reacted, but it also might show, hey, like we want to see how they react again next season in a similar situation,
Sure.
and then let's make our decision. So there could be two tails to the tape, but like I think really it's a good thing to have a coach like that put your players through the ringer, because it's only going to get tougher in the playoffs, right? Like
Well,
in those certain situations, and that's what he's trying to prepare them for ultimately.
yes.
So
And you look at the way Frost responded, calling him a fantastic coach at the end of the year.
that's what you would
I
want.
I think that they looked back on just missing the playoffs as a team and went, you
Fuck, we
know,
should have made it.
not
Like,
only that, I think they were like, the man's got a point.
yeah.
Like he's been pushing us so hard all year. Maybe at first we didn't understand. He does the rope shit with us in the beginning of the season. Like he's pushing us harder than we've been pushed. And then we like got to this point. We didn't necessarily take our foot off the pedal, but we didn't manage to maintain that
Yeah.
for 100% of the season. We lost it.
It's
So
all
the
learning
man had,
experience.
but the man had a point to push, 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 push. Because he's like, if you lose it, and one thing he says in Miracle, which I love, he goes, and this is like one of the down points for the team. He goes, you think you can win on talent alone? He goes, let me tell you something, gentlemen. He goes, you don't have enough talent to win on talent alone. And I think, and you look at this team, they don't have enough talent to win on talent alone. In fact, I'd argue 99% of the teams in the league don't have enough
You
talent to
have to
win.
work hard. There has to be a work ethic involved.
It's
And
almost above talent.
yeah, but it's a learning experience, right? To like put your players through something like that, that the Flyers are trying to do, that Tortorella was trying to do. Not only see how they respond, but see how they learn from it and see how they better themselves as players, because they realize that, hey, the coach has a point. Like I need to come into next season even more prepared, even more ready to give my all, so that I don't break down halfway through the season, or like injuries don't hurt me or
Right.
things like that. Like I think there's a whole bunch of different factors
Like,
all roped into one with that mentality. So
yeah, dude. And you look at Farabee, who was like on fire for like the first 60% of the season, then had like his ups and downs in that, like, I guess that last stretch, that last 25 game stretch. But that's in the back of Farabee's mind, where he's like, well, I want to be that guy, 100% of the season. I want a big contract. I want to be an 80-point player in the
He's
league.
probably thinking to himself, I had a really good bounce back year after the surgery, after a full off season of being able to train healthy. Like what can I do next season with even more time to train? Assimilating even more to the coach, understanding what he wants even more. Like, I think you're spot on that I do expect Fairby to have a very big season next year, like even more of a breakout than this year, I think.
Yeah, I think so too, man. I think that Tortorella being hard on these guys, like people keep talking about how he won't be here for the playoffs and the Flyers don't think he'll be the coach when this team is good. I've heard a lot of that, and it's like I don't really buy that. I think there's some of that
possible.
Again.
Yeah, he was also the coach for 6 years in Columbus, and he's only been the coach for 2 seasons here. So if you're going by that, there's still 4 seasons left.
Yeah. I mean, he's got 2 years left on his
exactly. So he might just play out till the end of that contract and see. But you have to wonder, right? Like if this team is knocking on the door and they went on like a deep playoff run, hypothetically, let's say when that contract ends, is he going to be like, well, let me step down now when we're so close to potentially winning a cup or something? Like, you have to look at his perspective. So who knows?
Yeah, and like, look, it might be the smart move to bring in another coach at that point and to change up the room. That happened. It happens to every coach has a lifespan. But I just don't look at Tortorella as like some kind of negative thing. There's so much of that, and everybody keeps assuming that Michkov is going to be ruined by Tor. I'm like, nonstop.
Anything he's going to help the kid, in my opinion. So
that's
the way I look at it.
We mentioned those players earlier. I love that you brought that up. What about Travis Konechny since Torts got here? He's
gotten way better. Look at Cam York. But
there are more wins in Tortorella's column of player development than losses.
And to your point, like you said, usually the guys he points out, that guys that can't handle it or won't be successes, they usually are not successful after they move on from him.
Look at Provorov, who I love, who was deemed not part of the future of this team. They moved on from him, and Provorov didn't evolve this year.
No, he looked worse.
So. Yeah, I still think he has another gear, but maybe he needed a wake-up call too, to some degree, to push himself. Or
his attitude just isn't in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, they were a really bad team, so I hate to put it just on him. Maybe he's definitely their second best defenseman, but behind Werenski. But sometimes you need a wake-up call. I think Tortorella is the master of that.
He definitely provides that for his team.
Well, 100%. I think he really is building the right kind of culture here, that the foundation is laid, that another coach can come in here and pick up and not have to rebuild a foundation.
He's the perfect coach because, like you said, he can kind of almost sense when the team is taking the foot off the gas, and he tries to ramp it up again even more because he knows it's not the right way to do it.
Well, you can't take your foot off the gas.
For sure. I'm just interested to see what's going to happen this season. I'm really excited with all the Michkov news. I'm interested to see how him and Michkov and Tortorella match. I personally think there might be some butting of the heads, but that's a natural thing. And I do think with all the experiences that Michkov went over in Russia, I think he's going to realize that if they do butt heads, the coach is looking out for him at the end of the day and trying to develop him as a player and trying to make him a better player. So we'll see how they kind of interact, but I'm really interested. And I do think Tortorella is doing a good job here.
I mean, look, there absolutely could be. My gut
it's natural over the season. You never know.
Yeah, but my gut tells me that that's not going to happen. I know that that's contrary to most of people's opinions. I don't anticipate that.
I could see it too. And the thing is because I think he's so competitive, Michkov, that I think it's going to line up with, the way Tortorella is as well. Very competitive, very focused on, the game at hand, being prepared. And Michkov seems like a guy that's ultra prepared. From what I've seen. So I think that's all going to line up. It might just be where there's certain defensive miscues or something where they end up having not
for sure,
not arguments, but disagreements on certain things on the ice. It can always happen. Right?
Look, it's absolutely possible. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but I look at what, again, just watching Michkov out there, I just see Tortorella understanding what the guy's strengths are in the same way he treats TK, same way he treats Tippett, who's also not amazing defensively. And what Jim said earlier, Frost didn't get benched because of his defensive play.
It was because the offense was there.
He would disappear in games. And I don't see that from Michkov.
I don't
I
think
could
he'll
see him.
disappear. That's
Yes.
for sure.
And I think Bobby Brink, while I'm still high on Bobby Brink, he is not on Michkov's level in any aspect of the game, except for maybe defensively. They're in the same boat. But again, if Brink can come in and put up 50 points in his first year, 60 points, if he's that level of player, then he probably wouldn't have been benched either. It was
Yeah, exactly.
he's balancing the risk reward. And that's where he kind of did that to Coots too, which people didn't accept. But Coots' defensive game dropped off. We know now because of an injury. We know he was being played injured. And I think they handled it publicly poorly. But I think the reality is that he wasn't playing up to his usual level, right? And his defensive game went down and his offensive game went down. I think Tortorella just kind of made a value call there. And I think he did that with Atkinson and Brink, and he did it. He shot Lawton all the way to the bottom of the team as well.
Well, it's interesting, right? That you bring that up. You can't say that he's singling out young guys because a lot of the guys he scratched for older players at the end of the day, right? So it just shows that that idea that he has it out for young players, he won't play young guys if they're not producing is pretty false, because we saw this past season when young guys were playing well, they were in, and veterans were out if they weren't playing well. So yeah, I think it's just interesting for Michkov in that relationship, because I do think if he produces, especially if he's a weapon on the power play and he's a significant weapon there, there's not going to be really a reason to want to take him out, because he's going to be contributing so much at that point that is it worth it, right?
Right. I also don't think he plays as risky game as people assume that he does. And so I forget the guy's name, but he's an elite prospects scout. And I saw him commenting how Michkov is not very dynamic. He's a high offensive player, but don't expect a dynamic type of player. And immediately I was like, yeah, you clearly are just saying that because you watched him 1 year in the KHL.
Pretty much, yeah.
And this is what I talked about is where we were talking about last time, is if you really watch Michkov versus players around his age, where he doesn't have to play up in age group, where he's been doing that for several years, he is a extremely dynamic player. He just kind of picks his spots, and he was forced to do that in the KHL for a while already. And he didn't try to deke out every single player in the KHL because he understood that these players are a lot better. He's a lot younger than they are. He didn't build up his strength and his speed to the point where he's fully mature. I think he kind of understands that about himself. I think there's a humbleness to Michkov that is underrated. And you see these Habs fans, every video I go to is they're Habs, dude. They are
attention.
But not only that, they are delusional about Demidov too. And I'm not putting Demidov down, but they have this mindset that Demidov's gonna walk into the NHL and be Connor Bedard plus. He's gonna be
playing the KHL. Yeah, you gotta have a little bit of reservation there. So,
but they're oh, he's a better two-way player. It's yeah, but that's not saying much, dude. He's a good two-way player.
It's Montreal fans, right? Hockey's crazy in Montreal. That's all I'm gonna say. I kind of expect stuff like that from that fan base.
Dude, so they're relentless. And I would recommend, if you're Flyers fans, do not get involved in those arguments.
Don't interact. Yeah,
it's honestly pointless.
Save yourself the time. Really,
both prospects are great. I'd rather have Michkov. I'd rather have
They're both friends, though. It's not like these guys hate each other, so it's really funny to pit guys together that are probably really good friends.
Well, they want to seem like the smarter organization that passed on Michkov but took Demidov. But the reality is that they took David Reinbacher in the top 5, and we took Oliver Bonk that year. And if you really look at it, they're comparable.
Yeah. So it just tells a story for you. But.
Yeah. And again, and I love what Jim said about Jet Luchenko. You guys can freak out over Demidov, and I love Demidov, but we might look back at that draft and Jet Luchenko might end up being the better overall player for all we know. No, we went through all the drafts. None of us really know what's going to happen. Same with Michkov.
Time will tell.
So. We say that Michkov has been on a generational pace, but we haven't seen him here in the NHL. Yeah. Time will tell on all of these. But the thing we should walk away with is the Flyers made good picks. Right? They hit so far in the early development part, they have hit on those picks. And we will see Luchenko now and I have a feeling he's going to have a monster year in the OHL. And I have a feeling we're going to look that people will look back at that draft and be like, the Flyers, forget Zebuyam. I still believe in him. But they'll look back and be like, oh, apples and oranges. Jet Luchenko was a home run hit for the Flyers.
Yeah, we'll have to
And
see, right? Like time
yeah.
will tell. I think that's the point with the draft. Like you can't really shit on the pick because we're unaware of what these guys are going to turn into at this point. They're so young, so we'll just have to take
Yeah.
a look and monitor down the line and see what happens.
Like let me ask you this. If we had Demidov and Michkov, who would you like more?
I would like Michkov just based on what I've seen, the scouting, and something against Demidov. I just look at the simple facts. Like one guy played against men and one guy did not. The production against men, I have to look at that more fondly and say, well, you produce in a harder league, harder competition. So that just puts you ahead. It does not mean that Demidov can't replicate similar production in the KHL as he starts to, begin his career there. So it's just a wait and see for both guys. Personally, I expect both players to be, really good NHL players in my opinion. So
I mean, Michkov put up Demidov's MHL productivity a year younger.
Yeah,
Did the same thing with Kucherov, all these guys. He is a year ahead of
So you
all
look
of
at the
these guys.
stats, and you have to take that into account. So it's going to be interesting. Obviously, like I said, time will tell. We just have to see kind of now,
Yeah.
if it plays out, if it translates to the NHL. Which I mean, my thought is it will, but obviously we will see.
Well, the good news is we don't have to wait too much longer, and Michkov is here.
Only a couple months, and we get to see Michkov in the preseason. So
I still have
camp.
No idea. I was thinking about this, and I'll just say this before we end. I was kind of like looking at the roster again. I'm like, all right, well, like we have to be a little more open. Like, what's gonna happen with Ulet Excel? What's gonna happen with like Delorier? Is Ryan Paling gonna take a jump? Jim brought up a great point. Like, what if he's better next year than Lawton really is not the third line center? Paling is.
I could
like,
really see that. Yeah.
Right. There's so many
trending that was trending
here.
that way last season to end the year. So
well, and again, he's a former top pick in the draft, like at least first round pick. Like he still has room to grow. And
he's only 25. Like
right.
I think with Paling, it's hilarious because he's really only 25. Like a lot of guys can, are entering their prime at this time, at this age. So like the best might be yet to come for him potentially.
Yeah. Like what if he's better than Scott Lawton? We don't really know. The more I look at that lineup, the more I'm like, man, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. I need to take a step back and we'll see what happens. And Michkov might start on the third line to start the year. I don't think so. I think it's going to be
never know,
second,
though.
But you never know. You really never know. We have no idea who he's going to play with right now, like at all.
It makes it fun, though,
guess.
To be honest.
Yeah. All right. Anything you want to leave our audience with?
No, just thanks, everybody for supporting us over the summer here. Obviously, the news is slowing down, but we're going to keep pumping out the podcast every week. And there's always articles going up on Flyers Nitty Gritty about something Flyers related. So just check out flyersnittygritty.com. Check out, the Flyers Nitty Gritty YouTube channel. We'll continue to bring the content for you all.
Yeah. Great episode. Again, just want to remind everybody, please like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for notifications. Follow us on iTunes and Spotify. Give us a ratings there as well if you can. If you're listening and you have not subscribed yet on YouTube, please do so. It's a tremendous help to us. Also, shout out to Jim Steaks at 4th and South. Make sure to go get yourself a cheesesteak from Jim Steaks. Shout out to Public Summit Adjusters, 215-752-0560. Go to them for your insurance adjustment needs. Again, that's Public Summit Adjusters, 215-752-0560. And a shout out to Sports Spider. Again, the link to Sports Spider is in the description of this video. They are your aggregator of NHL news, sports news in general. You can find all the sports there, but Flyers news, NHL news, podcasts, videos, all that stuff centralized there. So make sure to go check them out. And also make sure to check out Jim Jackson's broadcasting school. The link will be in the description. And this was a good one, dude. Good hockey day. Thank you all. We love you guys. And remember, always stay